I'm going to kick things off and first introduce my co-chair, John Delaney, former congressman from Maryland. And I'm Mike Ferguson, former congressman from New Jersey. We are co-chairing this commission. We're delighted to getting things kicked off here, and we'll make a couple of opening remarks in a moment. But before we get to that, I want to introduce our other special guest here today, former Congressman Will Hurd, who's going to make some introductory remarks to kick us off. Will, great to see you.
Thank you.
Glad you're here.
I get to start it off.
You do.
Like real start off. Well, look, I'm here to say what we do matters, right? What we do as a government matters, what we do as businesses matter, what we do as individuals matter, and to tell you like what y'all are doing this commission matters, right? And it blows me away the conversations I'm still involved in. I was in government when now that I'm out in the private sector, and y'all have a important message and something to do where you're gonna have to ignore left-wing nuts, you're gonna have to ignore right-wing nuts, you're gonna have to ignore super parochial business interests in order to put something forward that is going to do something, I think it's simple but hard. Uplift humanity, right? That should be our first principle. That should be how we think about this. And if y'all are able to put something forward and have the government take that up, and it starts with uplift humanity, then we're going to be successful. And one of the things, look, I spent a decade in the CIA, seeing how technology was used to try to catch me. I helped build a cybersecurity company. I spent 6 years in Congress. I held the first hearing on AI, helped develop an AI national strategy with the help of the Bipartisan Policy Center, which John's a board member on. And now I help technology companies that have a national security application. So I've had a front row seat on how technology is upending every sector. When I speak to kids, I started taking a new prop, and it's funny, none of them know what it is. It's a little box, and I open it up, and it's a typewriter. And when I open the box up, the kids all ooh, ah, and they start clapping. It's like I felt like I just unveiled like King Tut's tomb, right? And I tell them this is an actual typewriter I used when I was in 8th grade. And I say it's old, it's archaic, and then I whip out my smartphone and say, imagine a world when this is going to be old and archaic. And the technological change we're going to see in the next 47 years is going to make the last 47 years since the advent of the personal computer look insignificant. And we have to make sure we're ready. And unfortunately, we're at a political, cultural, international moment in time where it's hard to get big things done, right? And the thing I learned, the only way you get big things done is if you do it together. And that's not just Republicans and Democrats, it's industry, it's government, and y'all have an opportunity to drive some of these issues. And so, look, we collectively have to do something I learned when I was working in a computer lab, in Kane Computer Lab at Texas A&M University when I was a freshman in college. When the computer wasn't working, what did I do? Hit reboot, right? That's kind of what we need to get back to. I call it American Reboot. It's actually the title of my book coming out in a month. And for me, we got to get back to those basic principles. And those basic principles, what I led with, uplift humanity. We're seeing that right now in Ukraine, right? We think we know how things are going to play out, but if you think you're going to figure out the second, third, and fourth order effects, you're crazy, right? You're not. You're going to get it wrong. So start with the first principle. And to me, when it comes to artificial intelligence, I hope you started the clock, John. Yeah, grab me.
You're doing great.
To me, it starts with something that actually is uncomfortable for some people. We got to realize what made in China really means. We're in a conflict. There's no question about this. And I get asked all the time, like, Will, you're overestimating, I call it a new Cold War with the government of China. And they're like, but that's what they say about themselves. This is not me, interpreting some Mandarin expression that somebody 20 years said. This is literally what they say in English on their websites. The Chinese government is going to surpass the United States of America as the global leader in advanced technology.
Exactly.
Who is that? Yeah, there we go. You know, they concur. You know, God concurs.
Exactly.
Right, and so for me, it is. They started with 5G, AI, and quantum are connected. Y'all all know that. I'm preaching to the choir, but this is a competition, and let's make sure they play by the rules of the road. And
Chris, can you turn your camera off, please?
Who's Easton? And so for me, yes, it's okay. We're in a competition. And some ask,
Bonnie, can you turn your camera off, please?
Yeah. Hey, Easton, you're on. You need to put you on mute, my man.
Easton just got removed from the meeting.
We appreciate the enthusiasm.
Yeah, exactly.
If everybody could stay on mute, that would be
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, reboot his computer, right? But also, part of y'all's mission is to help educate people on these things. And it's not just educating elected officials. You got to educate and help explain this stuff to people that care about putting food on the table, a roof over their head, or taking care of the people they love. And if I wish I had all the answers, I don't. But we have to make a better case of why this matters and why we have to push forward. And we have to let legislators know that the political nonsense that's happening in Washington, D.C. is getting in the way of us to truly compete. And so you know, we have to embrace, we can't out-compete, we can't out-innovate. If the Chinese government is going to steal our technology and our IP, let's steal their engineers, right? Let's streamline legal immigration. Hello, like when every industry is looking for people, now is the time to streamline that. And if you're going to come to UT Austin or Texas A&M and College Station, let's keep you here as well. They're all looking what happened to Jack Ma and that woman who was like the first billionaire that got taken off the internet. Like nobody wants that. So we have a real opportunity, and y'all have a chance to do that. And then I would say this: imagine 10 years from now, it's the Europeans that are complaining that the American regulatory environment is moving so fast that it's harder for European companies to catch up, right? We also have to make sure our European friends recognize that when it comes to privacy, our transatlantic relationship views privacy better and more the same than they do with China. And so imagine 10 years from now, we're talking about how, you know, the public and the private sector work together, and the most disadvantage of our society were the ones that benefited first from all these new technologies. Because look, we can do it if we work towards a very simple basic premise, and that's uplift humanity. That's what y'all got to do, right? And under the direction, guidance, and wisdom of these two on my right, I'm pretty sure y'all can do it. So may the force be with y'all. That's all I got, John.
That was good.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's hear it for Will.
Sure. So, first of all, that was great, Will. It's good to see you again. We served together. I didn't have the privilege of serving with Mike, but Will and I definitely did some good work together in the Congress, to the extent you can do good work in the Congress. So, it's great to be with you again, and that was a great way to kick off our session. Those were inspiring words, and I think you're spot on. So, thank you. And it's great to be here with Mike, my co-chair. We're really excited for this work, and I want to thank all of our commissioners for joining us in this endeavor, and we look forward to an exciting outcome. And I want to thank in advance our panelists who are here to share their insights, because that's what it's about at the end of the day. So when I was in Congress, I founded the Artificial Intelligence Caucus, which was the brunt of many jokes, because when you throw the word intelligence around in Congress, there's a lot of opportunity there. But my view was that a couple things were happening. Number one, if you think about the future, And I had come from the private sector. I had started 2 businesses, took them public, and had a multi-decade kind of private sector career, where you're maniacally focused on where things are going, where the puck's going, and positioning your business accordingly. When you think about the future of these technologies, were clearly the most important thing to think about, because they were fundamentally shaping our economic systems, our social systems, and hopefully one day our environmental systems. And there was very little discussion about them going on in the Congress, but more troubling was there was just a fundamental lack of understanding, which makes sense because Will has an unusual background for someone who served in Congress, being so close to national intelligence issues and technologies. But most members of Congress aren't engineers, aren't data scientists. And I think the first evidence of that was when the first Facebook hearing occurred, and you watch some of the senators question the senior executive team of Facebook, and it was somewhat appalling, the lack of even understanding as to how Facebook worked, let alone the underlying technologies. So it was pretty clear to me and my colleagues who formed the caucus that we needed to create a forum to actually start talking about these ideas, thinking about them, not only from the perspective of our competitive position, which is Will beautifully articulated, really is our competition with China, where we have certain advantages, right? As a liberal democracy, we have the best universities in the world because fundamentally great universities can only exist in a liberal democracy, and that gives us a huge head start. But they have certain advantages too, not the kind of advantages we would want, but a lack of privacy and other things that allows, in many ways, their citizens to become kind of a giant experiment in their efforts to dominate these technologies. So there's a competitiveness aspect to it. There's huge potential associated with these technologies. And we've seen an accelerant of some of them during COVID. You know, the great tragedy of COVID has in fact also shown us that in areas like telehealth, et cetera, there's opportunities for these technologies to fundamentally transform our life. And if you look back over human history, innovation has clearly, by any measure, made the world better and better and better. And there's no reason to believe that won't continue with these technologies. But there's also some flashing yellow lights. Privacy, as Will talked about, is obviously an important consideration. The risk of embedding biases that exist in our society that we've struggled so hard to remove from our society, and we haven't done enough. But there's an opportunity for these things to be kind of hard-coded into these systems that will determine so many outcomes in the future. So there's tremendous work to be done in this area, which is why I was honored to play this role as co-chair with my friend Mike. And it's a privilege to work with all of you. And I'm looking forward to what we'll produce here, which in my judgment will be a series of kind of nonpartisan, fact-based recommendations that comes from a collaborative process, hearing from people on the front lines about what actually is happening. And with the input of such a great commission, present company excluded, and coming up with a series of smart and thoughtful recommendations. And I think it's going to be exciting. And I want to thank our friends at the Chamber for not only convening us, but organizing us and putting this in place. So I'm excited.
Super. Thanks, John.
Sure.
So thanks first, Will Hurd, for your presence with us here today. All three of us, I know, really enjoyed and valued the time that we were able to serve in Congress. It was a meaningful thing to get to do, but it's also really a pleasure to get to continue to try to do meaningful things as a private citizen, which is what we're all trying to do now, which is great. Thanks to John Delaney, of course, too, for your leadership, both when you were in the House on these issues and now as co-chair of this commission. Thanks, of course, very much to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to the Austin Chamber of Commerce for hosting us here today in their offices. I also want to draw people's attention to in the interest of time today, we're not going to be able to go through and introduce every single member of the commission, but this is an incredibly impressive group, and their bios and descriptions are on the Chamber's webpage, on the CTEC webpage for the commission. So I certainly encourage folks to read about the really impressive group that the Chamber has convened here on this commission. When it comes to the work of our commission here, and we're going to hear from some of our witnesses for the rest of the day. I really approach this thinking, well, what is the American public looking for on these topics, and how can we serve them? How can we serve the interests of America and the world in the work that we're going to be doing on this commission? And I think the American public has really spoken loud and clear about the importance of the United States being able to compete on the global stage. And not just to compete to win, but to compete because America represents certain values which are important for those values to be prominent on the world stage, I think. And technological innovation is one of the key ingredients, I think we would all agree, to make sure America leads in the world. You know, we're seeing right now how the private sector can assist in a place like Ukraine during a very, very challenging time in that part of the world right now, from using technology to thwart cyber attacks to repurposing satellites. There are so many ways that the private sector is helping to keep Ukrainians connected, to help innovation from the private sector that is continuing to keep in the forefront, trying to serve those who are in particular need right now. We recently saw, to Will's point, China and Russia pledging to collaborate on artificial intelligence. In fact, President Putin said, and I quote, "The nation that leads in AI will rule the world." Frightening words to be hearing from someone who's perpetrating war on Ukraine right now. This is, I think, one of the reasons why the United States has to lead in developing and advancing this fourth industrial revolution, artificial intelligence. If we falter, others who do not share our values are going to fill that void. 80% of Americans, by some measures, agree that the US should develop AI and that we are the best equipped to create the ethical standards, the framework that needs to surround the proper development of AI. Today's hearing, I hope, is going to take us another step closer to that by helping this commission to try to find bipartisan and durable recommendations around the fair and ethical development of artificial intelligence. And again, I want to thank everybody for being here in Austin. Those of you who are not local, thanks for traveling, like many of us have. And for those who are local, thank you for welcoming us to your community. And really looking forward to working with this commission as we develop some of these durable recommendations. Usually at the end of remarks, we say, "And I yield back." But now we're really just going to move on with our witnesses. And well, John and I will.
I failed to do an administrative thing.
Yes.
Everybody say cheers.
Cheers.
There we go. Thank you.
All right. Well, we're going to move straight into hearing testimony from our witnesses. We're going to go in the order that the sheet was handed to me. We're going to ask each of our witnesses to use about a 10-minute block for your remarks, and that will include the questions and further drilling down on maybe some of your remarks from our commission members. So first, I guess we're going to hear from Dave DeCaprio, and I would invite you to maybe briefly introduce yourself, and as a part of your remarks, maybe tell us a little bit about you and your work. But Dave DeCaprio, Dave is here. Dave, there you are. Dave is the CTO and co-founder at ClosedLoop.ai. Dave, the show is yours.
Hi, Dave DeCaprio. I'm CTO and co-founder of ClosedLoop.ai. We are a healthcare AI company founded here in Austin 5 years ago. What I work on is explicitly AI in healthcare. So about taking healthcare data and making predictions about who's going to get sick, how sick they're going to get, and what we can do to improve that. Particularly, we work a lot in reducing health disparities and proactively reaching out to ideally reach out before somebody goes in the hospital and lower the cost of care. I guess the claim to fame you can say of our company was in 2019, CMS sponsored the AI Health Outcomes Challenge, which was a $1.6 million prize it was a challenge. 300 teams competed to see who was the best at AI in healthcare. IBM Watson, Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, Deloitte, all the big names competed. The winner was a small company in Austin no one had ever heard of. So I led the team there. So I've been doing this for a long time. We have some credibility in the space. I'm never good at sticking to my prepared remarks, so I'm just going to say a few things. You mentioned immigration. Number one thing, talent. You need to bring in talent. I personally lost an incredibly good resource last year because his H1, somebody who was a master's student at Northeastern University, came from India. He was a master's student at Northeastern University, great AI talent, really young in his career, worked for me for 2 years, and then had to move to Canada because he didn't get his H1B. And because we're in healthcare, I can't have anybody outside the US. Everybody who's working, all of our data has to stay in the US. Contractually, I can't have anybody outside the US with access to it. So I lost a great resource. I'm a small company. We were 20 people at the time. I can't afford to lose somebody to a bunch of immigration. But there's no question to me that this guy is an asset to the United States. So number one thing is immigration. The second thing I'd say is I do believe there is a real need for regulation around this, particularly in healthcare. Health disparities are huge in the United States. So it's been estimated there's over 800,000 deaths a year due to health disparities. People just not getting treatment that's available to other people. That's like double the number attributable to smoke. Like, this is how large the problem is. And the default thing that is going to happen without regulation is that those disparities are going to get built into the AI models and automation that is increasingly being used to drive this. So most famous example is 2019, Overmeyer published a paper about a model that Optum, which is kind of the giant in the industry, was using. They were using cost. They were predicting who was going to be expensive and using that to figure out who to bring resources to. Hey, let's bring resources proactively to the people who are going to be expensive. Sounds like a good idea. The problem with that is that if you look racially, white people, on average, they are more expensive to treat for the same condition. Not they're more expensive to treat. On average, more money is spent treating them than treating other races. So if you just run that model, it was racially biased. It said white people were sicker on average than they really were. This became a lawsuit. It was a huge thing. There are ways around this. Don't look at cost. Look at the treatments people get, because those are the same. There's many other things, but the most important thing, I think, is that if we ignore these issues, they will get baked in. You have to actively ferret these things out and clean them up. And I think the most important thing in regulation at the start is transparency. Don't go mandating how people should do things. Let's just start by mandating. Let's have everybody explain what they're doing. And let's have everybody give insight into the methods they're using, and then we'll figure it out. Because simple solutions like you can't put race inside of a model that's used in AI is not always the right answer. There's some times where using race actually helps you reduce health disparities because the experience of the healthcare system is different. And so it's a case where I think we can't just assume we know what the right answer is. It's going to be a tricky question. And so I advocate for regulation and for transparency as the first goal of regulations. Kind of briefly where I had, I guess, questions.
So with respect to transparency, how would you recommend walking the line between having to disclose what they're doing, how they're doing it, and protecting intellectual property? That must be the resistance point.
Yeah, I think there is the data you are using to pull things in, which can be set. The IP is usually in the algorithm you're running, and I think you can separate those things in terms of, are you using this piece of data, and at a high level, how is that piece of data being used, and can you prove whether that piece of data was significant? And there are several techniques for doing that that are independent of the sort of core algorithm that it is possible.
David, you mentioned that not using race is not the answer all the time. Do you have views on when it would be appropriate, when not appropriate?
Yeah, there was a great article in the New England Journal last August. Maybe it was 2 Augusts ago. But there's basically sort of 3 things. The first is you need to have a plausible causal mechanism why race matters. So for many of the things we do, the experience of the healthcare system is very different. So you have a plausible causal mechanism. You need to have statistical evidence that that including race actually makes a difference and it's useful. And then third, you need to step back and evaluate, is this actually going to reduce health disparities, which is not a statistical or algorithmic question. It's really about how the model is used. So that's a summary, but there's a great article in the New England Journal, which I think I submitted some slides, and I think that's referenced in the slides. That's the framework we use.
So you create almost a burden of proof.
Yep. Yep. You know, do you have statistical evidence that it matters? Do you have a plausible causal reason why race should make a difference? And then can you step back and say, okay, if we apply this, including race is actually going to reduce health disparities.
Dr. Gill?
It sounds like you're advocating for transparency on the inputs of the model. How about the outputs and assessing sort of how the model performed and what's
Yes,
coming
absolutely.
through that? Okay.
Both. I think the outputs in healthcare that's absolutely necessary. Every model we build always comes with explanations behind it, and those are based on, hey, given that I saw this, here's how that impacted the patient.
And sorry, just to follow on, so there's an explainability piece for the outputs and you're wanting transparency around that. I know in healthcare, some of those AI systems tend to be incredibly complex that humans often can't always interpret why the outcomes were that they were. What would you like to see as far as regulation to sort of guide that?
Yeah, so I think explainability gets easier when you make it local explainability. So these models are very complex to try to understand how is it making a decision overall on every case. But when you get down to an individual prediction for an individual person, all models can be simplified at that point to, hey, if I change this, if I hadn't seen this, here's how the prediction would change. And so it's just like a doctor. Trying to ask a doctor, how do you diagnose this patient? How do you diagnose diabetes in general or complex disease in general is hard. But if you give them an explicit patient, a doctor can tell you, well, I saw this, this, and this, and those were the keys. I think if we focus on those local explanations, it doesn't really matter. But you can always, if you can't explain a local prediction, then I think the algorithm has a problem. Probably not something you should be using in healthcare.
So in terms of disparities, any thoughts on how you'd acquire the latent features that may correlate to disparities, such as socioeconomic status?
Yeah, socioeconomic status is one that's pretty easy to get and incorporate directly. And so collecting that data is an important thing. It's one of the things when you blind us, when we build models and we get blinded to all those things, we're going to be blinded to socioeconomic status and race. It's actually more difficult for us to make sure that the algorithms aren't biased. So there are many variables that are correlated. We depend on most of our data sources to sort of be able to give us access to that. In healthcare, we usually can. In a lot of other industries, I know that.
Yeah, we'll do one more question because we need to keep it moving.
Yeah, just building up on this conversation. I have also seen the point you said that if there is an attribute that's a protected attribute that is removed from the training, the algorithm can get worse for the minority. But I wanted to ask you, and I do teach that, I do say that, but I do want to ask you, do you have concrete evidence from your practice that if a model was trained without a protected attribute, it actually end up being worse?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I believe yes, I absolutely have that. We've seen that. I have built hundreds of predictive models that have been deployed in practice. Socioeconomic status always shows up. I don't care what health outcome you're looking at, it is better to be rich than poor. There is like every outcome is better. And so there are many cases where if you're looking to figure out who should I reach out to proactively for better education, if you exclude socioeconomic status, it's always going to get worse because you should always be biasing that education or socioeconomic status. That's one general case. I have a ton of very specific examples, but that's one general.
That's great, very useful. So just, Mr. Chairman, sort of personal privilege, if you don't mind. Is there a data set that the government has that you think it would be valuable for you to have access to? And I think that's a question for everybody on this panel and something that the group can say, is there data sets that we can further open up in order to drive the public-private partnership?
Almost certainly. I don't have one off the top of my head. I know we do use a lot of the publicly available data we have, all the census data and everything. We incorporate that today. I'm sure that's probably.
Dave, thank you. We're gonna, sorry, Melissa, we're just gonna keep going so everyone has their 10 minutes.
Very smart, thank you.
Next, yeah, really helpful. Thank you very much, Dave. Our next witness, maybe I'll do this group and you.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Panel. Iwao Fusillo, he's the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at General Motors. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And really appreciate Mike, John, and Will, all of the comments at the beginning. So my name is Iwao Fusillo. I am the Chief Data and Analytics Officer at General Motors. Prior to GM, I held the same position at the National Football League, the NFL. Prior to the NFL, I held the same position at American Express. So what I'd like to do for the commission today is to offer up a set of views around AI competitiveness, inclusion, innovation, all of the things we talked about at the beginning of the session today, based on nearly two decades of experience across multiple industries: financial services, media and entertainment, manufacturing, consumer products. And what I would say is, and I think some of the earlier comments really played to this, is what is old is new again, right? So, you look at all of the innovations that have happened since, Will, the invention of the typewriter, which I remember very well. And you look at all of the new technologies, the capabilities, the analytic techniques, and they always hold great promise. But sometimes they come with the peril of potentially inequitable outcomes, like we were talking about on the healthcare front with Dave. And that's particularly true on supervised systems. I'm going to come back to that later in my remarks. When I go back in my history, back to the typewriter as well, I did my undergraduate work at Princeton University. I was a mechanical aerospace engineer. And data science didn't really exist as a discipline back then. It didn't exist largely because the compute power and the data storage wasn't available at commercially reasonable economic prices, right? But in the 1990s, that all changed. It all changed because data storage and compute power began to become commercially available for some of the larger companies, right? The startups probably would have struggled back in the 90s. But the larger companies, certainly. And by the early 2000s, my observation over the past couple of decades, many industries, including financial services. So I was at American Express during what I thought was a magical time, because we started to see enterprise-wide use of data sciences to drive decisions at scale, business decisions at scale. So thinking about banks and financial services, we began to see massive production databases coupled with statistical models making millions and millions of credit underwriting decisions, just as an example. And many of us will remember, rightfully so, there were some incredibly powerful regulations that came out at about that time. The Fair Credit Reporting Act, right? Talk about the use of race or not, right, in underwriting decisions. Those types of regulations, we would view as certainly beneficial, right? Because it kept the banks in a mode of wanting to supervise. Back then it was statistical models. So here we are today. We have a new innovation called artificial intelligence. And at General Motors, I, along with our chief technology officer, Kent Helfrich, we run an AI ML summit every year. Over 1,100 AI ML professionals attend that every year. And during my keynote this year, I thought it was particularly important for me to lay out 5 key principles that I asked all 1,100 plus AI ML professionals to follow as they deploy AI and ML across manufacturing, supply chain management, sales, marketing, customer experience, any process you can think of in the context of, auto manufacturing. Probably you could think through a use case with AI and ML. So what I thought I would do with the commission is actually share those 5 principles. This could prove to be very useful in your future work. First, and we talked a little bit about this, data preparation. Probably the hardest and most time-consuming part of the AI journey, but I would argue probably the biggest return on investment. Missing or low-quality data, for sure, no matter how good your AI algorithm is likely to lead to anomalous and unreliable results. Missing data, even more dangerous, because missing data is usually systematically missing, which means it's likely to create bias. So data preparation was number 1. Second, return on investment. AI is hard, as Dave described. It is hard, and you need just the smartest and best talent in the world to do it. Make sure you actually need to use AI in the particular application you're talking about. Sometimes a business intelligence dashboard from Power BI, good enough. Okay, and so when you want to launch into AI, make sure that that return on investment is there. We talked about this just before. Explainable AI. So many companies have seen their AI programs sputter because they did not articulate the inputs and the outputs in a very easy to understand common business vernacular. And oftentimes, AI algorithms produce results that don't quite square with our intuition. So if we haven't explained the inputs and the outputs in clear business vernacular, and the AI results don't square with our intuition, wow, big recipe for AI not getting adopted in your particular company. So explainable AI is a big one. We talked about supervised AI. AI supervision, many a social media company, I won't name any companies, have allowed their algorithms to go unchecked. And in many cases, we see some very unintended and very unfortunate actually consequences. Widespread depression among the nation's teenagers have often been talked about as being linked to these things. Hiring bias, right? Many companies use AI and ML in their hiring practices. We often see, again, left unchecked. These could lead to very unintended hiring practices and bias therein. At General Motors, we do supervise our AI because we have an overriding intent to make sure it gets us towards our vision. Mission may know our vision around 0, 0, 0, which is all around making the world a better place. And that leads us to best practice number 5, which is using AI for good. Good for our customers, good for our people. General Motors is a member of a consortium called the Data and Trust Alliance. It was founded by Sam Palmisano and Ken Chenault. These are the former CEOs of IBM and American Express. And the 20 companies are companies of the like of General Motors, American Express, Johnson & Johnson, the whole gamut, the NFL. And the timeliness, we talked about this, the pandemic. The timeliness was almost uncanny. The Data and Trust Alliance was actually formed at about the time of the start of the pandemic. And so the timeliness was really quite powerful because we had an unprecedented sharing, Will, to your question, right? The government, the private sector, all opened up their data sets. And that created an unprecedented level of data sharing and an unprecedented level of AI and ML applications. So, you know, for us as businesses were changing their operating models, it was the perfect time to launch. So what does the Alliance do? Well, the Alliance establishes playbooks and best practices in using ML, AI, and data in a responsible way, and brings it to life with real use cases. So how can we help ensure analytics used in HR recruitment and development don't unknowingly bias towards or against certain genders, ethnicities, or age groups? That was one real project we embarked on. Should we create an academy with the chief data officers of each of our 20-member companies to teach non-data executives, both within and outside the consortium, around data and AI literacy? Right, there are many clear benefits to AI, and we're constantly, as a consortia, asking these questions to make sure we're harnessing the benefits of the data, but we're not inadvertently creating bias and unfair outcomes. Another piece I'd love to highlight for this commission is the impact and the role of media. The media, as we know, can sometimes glom onto sensationalist stories around AI.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes. Why do they do that? I go back to an incident that's somewhat local here. Back in 2016, the Dallas police used a remote-controlled robot to deploy explosive inside a building to kill a sniper who had already fatally wounded 2 police officers. A media outlet that characterized that as a robot controlled by the police killed a sniper, well, they would have it right. A media outlet that might report it as AI-powered robots are killing people would not have it right, but that would probably be a more sensationalist, title for an article. And so those are some of the things that we'd ask the commission to consider. The last thing is, and Will, John, and Mike, you alluded to this in the beginning, is where are we comfortable and where are we not comfortable with the use of AI? Right, so recommendations for product and services, probably pretty comfortable. Recommendations, Dave, back to your example, for medical treatments, I don't know. I don't know how the general public would react to that. But perhaps the public is fine in both of those instances, just as an example. Maybe the standard of the algorithm is different. So a product and service recommendation, we may say it just needs to be better than the average human. For medical treatments, it better be better than the best of the best medical professional. I'm making this up, of course, but that's the idea. And what I'd like to close with is General Motors is clearly looking to extend our data and AI agenda well beyond this data and trust alliance that I described before. So General Motors has nominated me for the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee, so the NAIAC, that I believe this commission knows, the Department of Commerce established to help advise the president, federal agencies, and others on a range of issues related to artificial intelligence. Certainly if my nomination was accepted, General Motors would absolutely look forward to serving our nation and the potential to improve 334 million lives and even more than that. As a member of the NAIAC, we play a role in ensuring continued U.S. leadership in artificial intelligence, R&D, trustworthy artificial intelligence systems in both the public and the private sectors, and a workforce that's ready to integrate AI systems across many of the sectors in our economy and our society. While there is no current regulation around AI in the U.S., regulators have clearly sent the message that it's on the horizon. We believe companies like GM are already crafting policies and procedures across their organizations to create a compliance by design program that promotes AI innovation, but also ensures the transparency and the explainability of our systems, right? The responsible use of AI. So we at General Motors were very, very grateful to have the opportunity today to further our work by participating in today's hearing.
Wow, thank you. That was fantastic. I know that our commission members are going to want to follow up with questions for you because that was a tour de force of a lot of interesting things, and you've seen a lot in your career. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we're not going to be able to do a round of questions right now, but I know that we're going to want to follow up with you on some of those things. So thank you very much. Thanks for being here today, and thanks for sharing some of your expertise with us. Our next witness is Melissa Kargiannakis. I'm sure I mispronounced. Is it Kargiannakis? Sorry.
Kargiannakis is good.
Okay, I was a little bit close.
Very close.
Melissa is the founder and CEO of Skritswap. I got that correct, I think.
You did.
So I did practice that earlier with Melissa. Melissa, thank you very much for being here. Please take your 10 minutes.
Awesome. And I'll keep it quite brief, as I would like to focus on questions for the most part. And I did want to use slides. And just full disclosure, unfortunately, I had a very important meeting. I could not move at 1:15, so I will have to skedaddle. But the agenda, basically, what we're going to go through is a little bit of an overview on, obviously, my background and what AI is, just as a refresher. Should the government even be involved? It seems like we agree that that is the case, and just some moments from history on why that is important. And then looking at some of the pre-documents and questions that were sent, talking about an independent body, how bias can actually be eliminated using AI, and disclosing what systems you're using, and then any areas where we shouldn't use it at all. So those are just the 4 areas that I'll cover. And with regards to my background, I run an AI startup that's heavy on natural language processing. I'm actually a Canadian immigrant, so I love hearing the immigration piece. I think it's critically important. And I came to America because of all the opportunities and because I was funded by venture capital in San Francisco. And it's even as a Canadian, it's surprisingly difficult. I've won awards from the Queen of England, top 100 most powerful women in Canada, top 20 most innovative companies in Canada, and all of that was before 30, which is fun.
I'm sorry we can't post your slides here, but I know you'll share those with us.
I will share them, yes.
So we'll be able to look at those more closely.
Yes. And then obviously you're a very knowledgeable panel, but just for a quick overview, I just wanted to remind us of the history of AI. This is not as new as we all think it is. Some of the early hypothesizing and models, if you will, come from the 1930s and 40s. And we see a lot of the work with Alan Turing. We see some of the work that even with Enigma in World War II, like that was really critical in those moments. That's like the earliest versions of artificial intelligence. And then the Journal of Artificial Intelligence was actually founded in the 1970s. And this is what the world looked like at those times. So it does go back quite far ways. For the sake of time, I'll actually skip this. You're all very knowledgeable. But in short, the simplest version of AI, if-then. Your if-then statements. That is at the very core and base of what AI is built on. And then pattern recognition with examples. What's fascinating is as humans, we need far fewer examples to do something well. I think of being in grade 7 doing high jump, which is hilarious because I'm 5'2". And I didn't need that many examples to figure out how to jump over the bar, but we need not hundreds, not thousands, but millions and millions of samples. And that's why, to your point, data is absolutely critical. On the topic of should government be involved, absolutely government should be involved. Government has heralded in so many incredible technologies across history and time. And I recommend this book as additional reading that talks about, and all of these other elements have hyperlinks in them as well. Like government has a role, absolutely, and has had a role in a lot of the innovations, even telephone and other former innovations across time. And even looking at Silicon Valley, living in San Francisco, the entire Bay Area was built on government subsidies in the 50s and 60s. The entire area. So subsidizing this work and making sure that, yes, you can regulate it, yes, you can put laws in place, but you also need to fund it. That's very important. So as you can see, we're flipping right along, moving quickly. In terms of an independent federal oversight, this is the best example and recommendation that I have. Model the FDA. Why? Because it's extremely similar. Think about it. It's complicated. There are dangerous and possibly deadly consequences. You need experts to be involved. the limitations matter. And I'll talk about in the 1940s, there were certain countries, including the United States, doing a lot of testing on humans in the health sphere that shouldn't have happened. So the limits matter. Putting limits in place for AI absolutely matters. And obviously, this is very long-term provision. The FDA, as we know it today, was founded in the 1930s, but its origins actually go back to the 1820s. That's a really long time. And I believe that the FDA is the best model if you're looking for a recommendation of how to go about building a body that regulates AI. This is how I would do it. In terms of can AI eliminate bias, I believe so, like without a doubt. And being a true millennial, of course I have just my slide. And the question there is, of course, but how? How is that possible? And that's much more complicated. Certainly we don't have the time for all that today. The first step, though, would be change who's building it. And I will call it out because it was International Women's Day this week and it's International Women's History Month. There are 3 women in this room. So it's just really important to recognize that. We need to change who's in the conversations, we need to change who's in the room, and we need to change who actually has the access to do this. The only final thing I'll add on that, I'm fortunate to have gotten VC funding, to come from a single parent home in a tiny town in the middle of nowhere, Canada, to get to Silicon Valley and get funded by top VCs was no easy feat when it was largely driven by networks, Ivy Leagues, ex-Googlers, ex-Facebook, ex this and that. To be able to get in and get my shot was no easy feat. And the fact that funding for women-led companies as a woman founder and CEO is stagnant at 2% since 2017 is unacceptable, and that is stagnating innovation. Moving on. There are other ways that we can use AI to eliminate bias. It can be done, but it really, really matters. To your point, the data. The data really, really matters. And during your testimony, Dave, when you were asking, when Will asked about the data set, one of the best data sets that the government has made available is the SEC Edgar data set. How many of you are familiar with that? So a few of you. My company is heavy natural language processing, specifically in contracts. That data set is incredible. Being able to look at every single contract that companies have is critically valuable. So what's fascinating there is any contract that has an impact on 10% of revenue, I believe, which is considered material, goes into the SEC for reporting. And then they just said, hey, if we have to report this anyway, let's make it a data set that can then be used for AI models, which is brilliant. That's how you have companies like Ironclad. That's how you have companies like Seal that was bought out by DocuSign for a ridiculous amount of money. That only exists because the government made that data set available in a way and in a format that engineers could use. And disclosures about AI, I know we talked about this, and Dr. Delaney asked a really great question about inputs and outputs. Absolutely, we should be disclosing it. We have regulations around pillows in this country. If we regulate pillows, we can and should regulate AI. If we regulate and tell consumers what is in your pillow, what materials are used in your pillow, in your mattress, in your couch, we should be doing that. Very simple. And again, some areas where we probably shouldn't be using AI, military, access to capital bias, and hiring, housing, renting, and other things to consider. Not necessarily don't use it, but privacy, personal information is critical, and et cetera. I'll leave it at that. We have 2 minutes left for questions.
Great. Questions?
Wow. Great. So what does your company do?
We take complicated information to make it more clear, specifically contracts. Instantly, a contract could go from a legalese to a grade 5 rating level or a grade 8 rating level.
Can I bug you about the FDA approach we're talking about? Do you have thoughts on how valuable, how well it would fit for such a broad spectrum technology? Like with FDA, you have food and drug, very clear mandate for what it's focused on. For AI, it might be a bit more broader, given that it's used everywhere. Is that not a problem in your thinking on this?
I mean, the FDA honors a lot of things. I mean, food is huge. Food is extremely broad. Pharmaceuticals are extremely broad. Diagnostic tools are extremely broad. And there are some things that have to be FDA approved and some things that are just kind of on the fringes. And you sometimes need to report into that area, but you don't need to actually get FDA approval if it's not, I think, treatment related. You know more about that field than I do. But I would say the FDA is equally as broad and has equally as many facets and complications. And I think it's the best example for how you should recommend a body that regulates AI.
Really? Excuse me. Oh, go ahead.
All the speakers so far have talked about data as an essential resource, and access to it is critically important. It also, that access is an impediment, however, in being able to innovate because it's expensive, it's hard to get, there are barriers to get it. Does anybody have any insights as to how that should be made easy to create a national data resource of sorts that's available for startups?
I mean, if we want to tie in all of the pieces that we've talked about today, if the United States government wanted to take all of the data that people are reporting anyway, maybe even things that don't have personal identifiable information, but like I mentioned with the SEC EDGAR database, there are all sorts of things that individuals and businesses have to report to the government all the time. If you wanted to combine immigration, educational opportunities, and the arduous task of cleaning up data and just hire a whole bunch of new grads in machine learning with master's degrees, with undergraduate degrees, heck, even summer student opportunities, and all they do is spend time cleaning up government data, that would be an investment over 20, 30 years that would be well worth the United States time and effort. That would also have tremendous impact for folks who are learning and coming out of schools.
I might even add universities, right? So universities are very likely to be sitting on completely disconnected, but extremely valuable information. So I remember talking to my alma mater, Princeton University is a research institution. And we were talking about, I believe they have done it, hiring a chief data officer. None of the universities are really doing that in any big way. But the idea is exactly as you're saying, was it to structure, to organize, to engineer the data so that anybody in any sector could actually analyze all of the research institutions' data in one fell swoop. Right now, it's very difficult. For all we know, the cure for persistent diseases actually already exists, but you can't stitch together all the data and put the AI against it. We don't have it, right?
Melissa, thank you very, very much. That was fabulous. Congratulations on your success. It's a great story. Holy mackerel. And it's inspiring. And you got a lot of very good, interesting thoughts too. I've spent a lot of my policy time in my life working with the FDA, and it's a very interesting suggestion. So thank you. Last on this panel, waiting very patiently, Douglas Matty. He's the Director of Army Artificial Intelligence Capabilities. Melissa just made mention of military in one of her slides. Very interested to hear your thoughts on this, Doug. So the floor is yours.
So I have some prepared remarks in the interest of time. Sorry, I'll just kind of hit the high points. Sure. And just follow up with that. I'll kind of couch it to bring it up a notch, if you will, in terms of the strategic implications that I think we're all looking to address. So anytime you have a strategic discussion, you end up thinking about ends, ways, and means. It's kind of the framework we do that. So no surprise, much like you heard from Mr. Hurd, where we talked about what are the objectives that we have. So for us, predominantly it's to enable our soldiers in terms of how they defend our nation, both in the application of what's called multi-domain operations, but it's really about how do we enable our soldiers, protect our soldiers, allow them to do the challenging mission sets that we ask them to execute. I'll skip down, if it's okay, to the means. So with our effort going back to as early as 2018, when we established what was then the Artificial Intelligence Task Force, we established that in Pittsburgh. And simultaneously, many of you may be familiar with Army Futures Command was established here as the first 4-star headquarters in nearly 42 years here in Austin to take advantage of the innovation and all the dynamic startup activity, entrepreneurship that was going on here in Austin. The decision was made to put us in Pittsburgh. And so some of the key aspects that we've seen up in Pittsburgh that have helped lead to the success of going from an AI task force now to the Army's Artificial Intelligence Integration Center with more than tripling the cadre and the folks that are up there working there. is really geared towards the ecosystem as well. And so what you find there in Pittsburgh, and it's like this in a couple of other areas, but not enough. And that is this blend of academic and leading research, both at Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh. You also have government role in there with the federally funded research and development center. So not to our RAND, but we have RAND, we have SEI. I mean, there are specifically designed organizations that bridge that gap between industry and public-private relationships, et cetera. And then, of course, you have the innovation ecosystem with our industry partners. Things like you have Robotics Row, where you have a number of spin-outs from Carnegie Mellon and other universities, as well as those larger corporations that we all recognize as being, quote, technology leads, have then bought up some of those and established a presence in Pittsburgh. And so you start to get that feedback or that virtuous cycle of interaction amongst our industry partners. And so with us being immersed in that area of Vice being out in a post or distant camp station, et cetera, we're actually part of that effort and embedded in that to bring those things together. And so what we've done based on our interactions and working with those is we've focused on really 5 main lines of effort, if you will, and that's what's helping drive the progress. First, you talked about it somewhat with this discussion about data. It's actually broader than that, which is, and you see some folks that are out there laying in these environments that allow the sharing of data and code, and collaboration on algorithms and development. And that's a lesson learned that we've taken heart. We're working to have that established, not only for internal development to the Army, but our industry partners, our research partners, so that we can share the data, share the algorithm, really actually have that virtuous feedback. And so we have an AI platform, is the term of art that we're using to facilitate that. The second, and we've touched on this as well, as our workforce. We are not able to just allow others to come in, but with that embedding in the ecosystem, we can actually leverage lots of those folks. So as you heard from some of my other panelists here, there is great talent, but it's in a global sense. So how do we harness that to help further the research so that then we can have the appropriate folks that have access to data, those other specific kinds of applications, bring their talents to bear. So it has to be a blend of both external, internal folks from our standpoint. And to do that, we've done a tiered approach, focusing on leadership development. Because again, when you think about AI in a broader sense, you have to have leaders that understand it. I go back to your comment earlier, sort of about how do we, have a discussion at a testimony hearing, and do they understand the questions they're asking or the answers they're getting? We've addressed that head on because, again, the Army is driven by leadership. We also think about our workforce in terms of the users of the AI. So for them to just blindly hit a button, a lot of folks may use an app and say, I click on it, and they say, oh, it tells me to go left or right. They don't understand the underlying assumptions as to why it's telling them to do that. So think about 400,000 trainees that I'm responsible now to make informed AI users. That's where we're going with that. And then in the middle are the folks that do that development. And again, it's easy to get enamored with the PhDs and the master students that we all know help do this development. But from our standpoint, just like the NCOs or non-commissioned officers, the backbone of the Army, we've identified this role called AI technicians. And there are master gunners, if you will, that will take those technological advancements that our professionals develop and then make it deployable and realistic and have that operational relevance that we need to have for its implementation. So the AI technicians are really the center of gravity where we're going. What's nice about that, I'll just go a little bit deeper on that, is so we asked our contemporaries, their partners, if you will, at Carnegie Mellon, how are they helping the industry prepare for the advent? And so they had a challenge. I read an article that talked about Microsoft, for example, is going to develop 15,000 machine learning engineers. I said, okay, finally you're starting to talk about scale. I said, how are you going about doing that? And so the faculty there at Carnegie Mellon said, we're actually reaching into the community colleges. And I found that interesting that they were reaching that far up into the talent supply chain, if you will, to get folks that aren't necessarily interested in doing that because they may or may not have been exposed to it. And again, small town, don't have the advantages of high-tech high school or secondary education, et cetera. And so they give this course to those community colleges for free so that they can help inspire folks to do that. We've taken that, leveraged it, made it scalable, distant learning kind of format, so we can go across the Army to touch all of our soldiers, whether the reservists, active duty, et cetera. And so it helps us reach in and find and develop those AI technicians that we really need to have. Last three things that I'll talk about is, the projects are absolutely essential. We talked about ROI. We're working on projects that are not only directly responsible for our mission, but also supporting that mission. So for example, the first project that we worked on came from what's known as the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center up at the DoD level. And so they were trying to work through and establish, I'll say, trust with our industry partners as to what kinds of projects would be useful. And so they asked the Army, since we already had spun up our team, if we would help take lead on that effort. So we did. It was predictive maintenance. And so the ability for us to take care of, in this case, aviation assets, make sure that when our soldiers take off and fly and execute those missions, they know maintenance-wise they'll return safely, and potentially even have benefits for savings on the cost of operating those fleets. That was also a big win for us. And the next thing I already touched on a little bit with partnerships is we've got, thank you for Congress in terms, and you don't hear that often, giving us special authorities that allow us to have these flexible contracts and relationship with industry partners so that we can learn as well as the industry partners can develop. And I think that's absolutely essential in terms of the new acquisition authorities that have been given to the Department of Defense that allow us to learn together, scale together, much like you would see in industry. You don't just start off as a blue chip company. It takes a while to grow and develop those things. So we're always exploring the partnership piece. And then the last thing is, we talk about ethics, every aspect of our development process. There is nothing that we can think of where we're not compliant with the law of warfare, ethical considerations, statutes, laws, et cetera. It has to be embedded not only in the development, but even as far back as project ideation, where we say, what is the real purpose of what we're trying to accomplish with this capability? So it really ties in to do that. We were the first service to actually establish a chief ethics officer. So we've named that role. We've developed a training pipeline so that we have folks that actually can come in and help us with those frameworks and understand what those implications are. And so we continue to extend the ethics work into the Department of Defense now has a very large effort in responsible AI. And that extends both the, I'll say, the logical aspects of the ethics as well as the empirical aspects of the underlying data and those types of technical issues. So that's a quick summary of what I can offer to you in terms of written testimony.
That's amazing. Thank you. We're looking forward to reading the full testimony that you put together, and certainly looking forward to following up with you with questions also. I know we don't, unfortunately, we're just behind on our time, but this has been thanks for your service. This has been a powerful panel. I'm blown away, but thank you. Yeah, really, really impressive. Thank you, all four of you, for the work that you're doing and in the private sector and in the people that you're serving, especially our country. Doug, thank you. And we're looking forward to following up with you with additional questions as we continue with the work of the commission. We are going to take a 3-minute break. You were promised 5, you're not getting 5. You're getting 3 minutes. So we're going to come back. John is going to lead us through the next panel, but let's reconvene in 3 minutes.
Great. All right, so let's get started. We have 4 panelists for this session. Robert is here in person, and we've got at least 2 of our 3 virtual panelists. Thanks for dialing in. You've got the whole of the AI Commission here. I'm John Delaney, co-chair, and I'm joined by my co-chair, Mike Ferguson. So we're grateful for your time today. We're going to try to get through this within our allocated time, which means wrapping up at about 2 o'clock Austin time here. And so with 4 participants, maybe if we could steer you all, each of you, towards 10 minutes, maybe with 5 minutes of remarks, and then 5 minutes for questions from the commission. We've got incredible members on the commission with deep expertise in the subject matter, so we want to have an opportunity for you all to ask questions and dig in a little deeper. So with that, Bdar, I'm going to start with you. You want to kick us off? I think you're muted.
Yeah, I'm ready for it.
Great.
So first of all, I would like to thank you, members of the commission. Thank you for the invitation. This is such an important topic, and you were right to make it happen today. Let's start with a quick definition, because it's very important to understand artificial intelligence from an economic point of view. I would like to share with you some insights linked to artificial intelligence in economics. Just in a nutshell, I'm the founder and president of AI Together, gathering leaders of artificial intelligence. I'm also a speaker, writer, and entrepreneur on artificial intelligence. But in a nutshell, artificial intelligence is a set of algorithms intending to automate tasks. Actually, artificial intelligence is not a typical tool. It's a systemic tool, meaning it will have an impact in all sectors, simultaneously. Consequently, it will cause a drop in costs, and it's gonna create such an important value. Meaning, in terms of competition, it's gonna give us the opportunity to create new businesses, unknown businesses. But one condition is very important. To make artificial intelligence successful and inclusive, there is a very important key condition. We need to tackle the unbankedness. In the US, we have up to 25% of Americans who are unbanked or underbanked. And however, artificial intelligence and metaverses require banked people to be fully connected to the banking system, because artificial intelligence and metaverses need a connectivity, a better connectivity. We can't take advantage of artificial intelligence and improve inclusion without solving this issue. Moreover, even for the better competition firms that would like to compete thanks to artificial intelligence need also banked consumers. Artificial intelligence companies need data to grow, and solving this issue will also help develop economy and take new market shares. After solving this issue, we will be more likely to fully consider data as a real funding for companies. And this is great news, because data is based on the process of unlimited creation of data. And this will have a positive impact on competition if we consider data quality. But this is a technical issue, and we are not going to cover that today. And artificial intelligence give us the opportunity to enter a new era, the cognitive capitalism, based on data and energy in general. And actually, cognitive capitalism needs consumer participation to develop. Indeed, cognitive capitalism is increasingly based on data processing. And remember, don't you remember in 2019, Amazon offered its premium customers their browsing data in exchange for $10. Tech companies have realized that data is more valuable than currency. If we commit to strengthening economic competition, the use of data must be central to the strategy. There is a very important element that underscores what I have just said. The value of money today is decreasing. The $20 bill in your pockets is decreasing in value. In fact, when the interest rates are low, there is more money in circulation. So the value of money decreases. This means that there is a negative correlation between the amount of money in circulation and its value. However, the story is different with data. Its value is increasing on a daily basis, and the correlation between the volume of data available and its value is totally positive. Meaning, when there's more data available, the value of data increases. They show that in the cognitive capitalism, in the cognitive era, driven by artificial intelligence, gonna create huge opportunities and strengthen economic competition. But it will also increase the inclusion, because in the past, in the modern capitalism, in the traditional capitalism, competition and inclusion are opposing concepts. But with artificial intelligence and the use of data, competition and inclusion are no longer opposing concepts. Meaning that with artificial intelligence based on people participation thanks to data, we're gonna accelerate competition, but we will also improve the economic inclusion in general. And just one last remark, one last thing. Each year, we waste up to 50% of data. I mean, 50% of data each year is not used by artificial intelligence systems. It become actually dark data. And if we consider data as a funding, you would understand actually that we should create a new strategy in order to help companies to better use data in order to feed their artificial intelligence systems, and finally to increase inclusion and to better develop the economy in general. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. You have more to add? Should we open up for questions, Bdar?
Sorry?
Do you have more comments, or can we open it up for questions?
No, we can go for questions.
Because you raised a lot of very good issues there. So who wants to kind of first question?
I can go first.
Yes.
There's a great conversation, first of all, talking about economics and data. The question I was thinking about is, if you think nationally and you put the construct of data being an asset, how should we think about systematically building the data as an asset at national level?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Actually, it's all about the architecture. You know, today in the financial sector in general, we have built a very complex system in the financial markets in general, and we have very difficult, complex product like derivatives and so on. Actually, that kind of products were very difficult to build because there's like an abstraction, and there is an increasing abstraction while you create more and more complex product. And actually we can do absolutely the same with data by putting data in the center to strategy and to an architecture. So to build a new architecture, this is very important to understand that now tech companies or companies in general are better considering data when actually the hardwares are sufficiently developed to create value, to create information. So we need actually a perfect collaboration between the private sector and the public sector in order to create a new architecture. And the US can get this role to influence people, to push other nations, other countries to do the same in order to create a new international data system where we can actually exchange data and also create new opportunities. We did it for the financial sector with very difficult product. I mean, I have been working for years in the financial sector as well, and I noticed that we are working on such complex products, and we can use data in that kind of architecture. We just need a perfect collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. And just one comment about that. I don't know if you have noticed what's going on in Asia. There is a new strategy named state capitalism, meaning that the most important strategy we use in the Asian countries in general are based on the collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. And you know, the private sector is an offensive force, and you need the state, the public, to regulate and to give the opportunity to the private sector to develop. And this is the right strategy if we want to make artificial intelligence useful for companies, but also for people in general.
Thank you.
Can I just ask?
You please, yeah.
What happened to privacy? Is that relevant in this vision of the world?
Indeed, privacy is a very important topic. Actually, we do the same for the financial sector. You know, in the financial sector, you have very sensitive data. You have very complex data we can't display or, let's say, publish on social media channels or whatever. And there is no, today, there is no objection to create a similar architecture and at the same time, let's say, protecting people from any disclosure. I mean, it's very important to understand that it's all about how we can put in place a strategy between the public sector and the private sector. We have the technical knowledge. We have the right mindset. We just need this perfect collaboration. If we, if we consider the example, the case of China, you see that this growing economy has been based on a perfect collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. This is the new way of doing business in the future. You need two forces that team up in order to give to people to give them the opportunity to grow. And in terms of privacy, we can also create new agencies, new public agencies composed of, data scientists or artificial intelligence leaders to monitor that kind of strategies. This is, a new way of thinking. We need to refresh our thought and our spirit about this issue.
Any more questions for Bdar before we go to our next panelist? So 50% of data goes dark.
Yeah, indeed.
Meaning it never gets used again for any purpose.
No. That kind of, we can reuse it if we, for example, refresh our hardwares in the companies. But we need actually to help companies to increase the digitalization. That we need to help them to understand that data is more valuable than money, than currency in general. And this is very important to share with companies in general. And 50% of data. It's more than the US debt. This is crazy.
Right. Very interesting. So our next panelist is Robert Armstrong. So Elizabeth, we're going to go from the digital virtual world to someone in person here and then come back to you in 10 minutes or so. Just want to give you a sense because we're just going in order with our list here. So Robert Armstrong from SAP.
Sir,
thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. Representative Delaney, Representative Ferguson, and distinguished members of the commission, good afternoon. My name is Robert Armstrong, and I am the Senior Manager for Government Affairs at SAP. And I cover the central 17 states, including, obviously, the state of Texas. So thank you for allowing me to testify today. I'll try to keep this short and sweet. My boss said, longtime boss in the legislature, the only good testimony is short testimony. So I'll try to keep to that. But I'm not a technologist, so I will have to read a little more than I would like. I do want to say congratulations to the Austin Chamber. I think some of them are watching virtually, but they hired Susan Old, another legislative staffer here from Texas that I worked with a lot. She was absolutely probably one of the smartest staffers in the state of Texas. So. But prior to being at SAP, just so you have my quick background is I worked at DIR, which is a state agency that oversees cybersecurity, technology, and then technology procurement for the state of Texas. And then spent, undergrad and throughout law school my entire time, and then 10+ years in the Texas Capitol, which y'all haven't seen, you need to go look at. And I'm sure y'all know this, but it is taller than the US Capitol. Everyone there will remember Texas.
What a surprise.
So, welcome to Texas. So who is SAP? As members of the U.S. Chamber, we are one of the world's largest enterprise software companies. And we have over 1,000 employees. We have over 500,000 customers, and we're in 25 industries, sectors in 190 countries worldwide. For me personally, in the U.S., we have 25,000 employees, but we have 1,300 in Texas, and our key offices are in Plano and in Houston. SAP has 99 out of the 100 largest companies as customers. 77% of the world's transactions revenues touches an SAP system, usually through our ERP system, which we're known for. And about $3.7 trillion in digital commerce runs through our business networks on an annual basis. Beyond the private sector, SAP supports national, state, and local government enterprises. This includes 15,000 public sector customers, 130 countries, which all run SAP. Now to get into AI. So SAP and AI, SAP commends the U.S. Chamber for launching the AI Commission, as it is an important step in advancing U.S. leadership in the use of AI technology. SAP has made significant investments in AI technology and is helping our customers deploy AI solutions to improve their products, services, and entire business models. SAP and ethics, specifically to get into things like obviously the internet, cloud computing, mobile devices. The emergence of AI is transforming every sector of the economy. As a German-based company, we have to obviously deal with the European laws, and we are headquartered in U.S. with a office in Philly, our North American headquarters. So we're uniquely positioned to contribute to the global public debate on AI. We are working closely with the European Commission high-level working group on AI and are engaged with AI officials at the White House to share our perspectives. To ensure responsible development and sale of AI applications, SAP was one of the first companies to publicly release guiding principles for AI, which was in 2018, and set up external AI ethics advisory panel and internal AI ethics steering committee. So just on basic recommendations, I personally in 2019 and in 2021 encouraged state agency helped pass laws in Texas to encourage state agencies and local governments to use next generation technologies. Specifically, 2054.601 of the Texas Government Code encourages state agencies and local governments to consider use of technologies such as RPA and artificial intelligence. Obviously, with laws, and ordinances from local governments, we recognize that absent global standards and federal regulations on AI, there is an interest from state and local governments to regulate. We believe that before local policies are developed, policymakers should ensure that the proposed rules are in line with existing regulations and that they do not lead to burdensome rules that could hinder recent investments and interest in AI. Before policymakers move to impose burdensome rules to regulate AI, stakeholders must have time to implement the new technology and need to have flexible governance as these technologies mature. To ensure the responsible development of AI applications and position the U.S. as a global leader, U.S. policymakers must embrace common sense regulatory approaches that invest in AI research and development, open government data, and support the creation of global AI standards. In conclusion, SAP believes that AI has the potential to unlock boundless potential for business, governments, and society. Today's hearing is an important part in ensuring AI technology is used responsibly and ethically, and we commend the U.S. Chamber and the members of the AI Commission for your efforts. We appreciate your consideration of our comments and recommendations. Thanks for having SAP testify today.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Very good overview. Questions for Robert? Adam.
You mentioned SAP does some work with EU level with the high-level group on artificial intelligence. Maybe you could offer some reflections about how that process is playing out. I know as of late, there's been some new EU working papers, white papers rather, on artificial intelligence and its governance, talking about the need for prior conformity assessments with new regulations that are going to be going into place or existing ones like GDPR. Could you maybe offer us some feel for, is that a model EU should be considering, or does it create some of the burdens that you say SAP is concerned with?
Like I said, if I understand your questions correctly, I would say SAP's luckily, a company based in the EU, or out of Germany. So we're kind of used to where we abide by those regulations already. We actually think it would be a benefit, as we're seeing, data and privacy legislation taken on now by 5 states as of yesterday. We see actually there was kind of a federal framework that would actually probably benefit versus having local governments and states all taking a different approach. Of course, something reasonable and working with, both higher education professionals, working with the private sector and government professionals, making sure that, kind of that framework is done properly. I think is something SAP would encourage.
Other questions? How would you avoid fragmentation of your AI systems if there's large disparity in policies from region to region? What are your thoughts on
that? Well, like I said, I'm a technologist. I'm just a government affairs guy, but I do think looking at what our company did to set up the guidelines in 2018, I think that is something that SAP, we tried to address, was to really create an approach, and it doesn't matter if you're in state government or if you're in a state, if you're in another country, if you're all across the world, that everybody should have an ethical, a moral, and then of course a business side, confidential side. Privacy was brought up in the last question, so I think that's why we created the 2018 guideline way before any regulations came out, other than GDPR, of course, but was to create hopefully a system that works no matter where you are.
Dr. Gillum, you had a question.
Some of the regulatory proposals in the United States are really focused on social media companies and algorithms in that context. You mentioned as an enterprise company. Can you explain sort of what you're advocating for, if there's needs to be a distinction between the AI systems that are being regulated and the type of appropriate regulations that might be different in the enterprise context?
Yes, that's been brought up. That was brought up yesterday on a meeting I was on. Privacy and all the privacy conversations, and there seems to be legislation obviously on the federal level and on the state level targeting more social media versus enterprise software, hopefully, but for sure at this point. So, gosh, that's definitely something needs to be considered is the difference between the two. But we, as a company, I do know that we look at both types of legislation that would affect either enterprise software and or social media, because there's a lot of, while right now there's a lot of targets on social media, there's a lot of unintended consequences that would affect all types of technology. I'm not sure that really answers your question, but I do know there is a link between the two that we have to be very aware of, especially us state government affairs folks who are keeping track of 50 different states and 50 different bills that are targeting certain types of technology, but have a lot of unintended consequences.
Well, great.
Thank you,
Robert. Thank you for being part of this today. Appreciate it very much.
Absolutely.
And thanks for your participation.
Thank you.
Elizabeth.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Very well. Thank you for your patience. You're up next. So if you wouldn't mind beginning your testimony, and then we'll have some questions for you.
Sure, thank you. So hello, I am Elizabeth M. Adams, and I bring you greetings from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I would like to first thank the Commission for the opportunity to share my perspectives today. So I've worked as a technologist for over 20 years, directing large-scale efforts for Fortune 500 companies and government organizations. I'm currently an affiliate fellow at Stanford University's Institute for Human-Centered AI, and I'm also the Chief Ethics and Culture Officer for Women AI, a global community of over 10,000 women. In addition, I'm working on my executive doctorate of business administration at Pepperdine with a research focus on leadership of responsible AI. But for the past 5 years, I've focused primarily in the AI ethics space, and I have expertise in depth working across civil society, government, industry, and academia. But today, I'm offering testimony as a private citizen and as the CEO and founder of a small woman-owned business. I am the community. I consider myself brilliant and bright and credentialed. However, I'm having trouble finding funding to explore AI-powered solutions that, in my view, could put vital data in the hands of policymakers and leaders across our nation with the touch of a finger. So I'm not a unicorn by any stretch of the imagination. Others, such as myself, have connections with industry, government, academia, and civil society, but are facing enormous hurdles finding a place to explore AI innovation, whether it's jumping through hoops to navigate various diversity and supplier initiatives offered by Fortune 500 companies with different requirements, or being told to pitch your ideas to venture capitalists, or to apply for a slew of accelerators or incubator programs, or spending countless hours navigating the SBIR site, the Small Business Innovation Research site, to comb through RFPs to hopefully find a match for a project that matches my technology interests. Only to find my peers and I are still looking for solutions to bootstrap our ideas. So how am I supposed to believe that there is a place for me in our country where I can participate in the AI ecosystem and participate in competitiveness, inclusion, and innovation if at every turn I'm met with more challenges than solutions? When my colleagues and I get through the door and we're met with gatekeepers, we hear, well, that's not what we're doing here. That's not our focus, or we have more people than spaces in our program. Come back next year. These are all common phrases. And how is it supposed to motivate a community of brilliant minds, brilliant technologists, brilliant innovators? And how can I lead efforts to build community trust if I am the community and I and we don't see that these opportunities for AI exploration exist for us? What I'd like to see is an organization like one I've managed many, many years ago for a government agency. I was the head of a systems integration lab with over 200 technologists. It was a place where we could contribute to the development of technology-based real-world solutions. And it was my responsibility as the leader to ensure that new technologies introduced into our environment receive the resources and tools needed to further develop and integrate into our ecosystem. The program benefited a lot of small business owners, but they didn't look like me or have my lived experience. They received assistance, but it came through channels that were never really clear to me. And as a scholar practitioner, I currently spend my time working with CEOs and executives to increase stakeholder participation and broaden stakeholder involvement in the development and design of AI-enabled systems by adopting responsible leadership in tech inclusion. While I enjoy this role immensely, I often ask myself, if I spend so many hours advocating for tech inclusion, when do I get to spend time working on innovation? And if I spend so many hours navigating programs for small businesses with multiple requirements and multiple deadlines, when do I get to spend time working on innovation? Many of us don't have anywhere to turn to help drive innovation and provide the best technologies for the world. So here are the most pressing issues I have observed in 4 areas, as well as potential solutions. For civil society, we need opportunities for exploration and training and a reduction in hurdles for success. With the government, training and videos to help policymakers and staff understand the power of AI and the capabilities of AI and why it may require oversight and regulation. I've spent a lot of time educating policymakers on the same topic. And in industry, partnerships that include broader stakeholder involvement and not othering, such as considering communities of color and vulnerable populations as part of a diversity and inclusion project, but seeing civil society members as equals and essential in terms of knowledge sharing and ability. We need funding to allow technologists like me to experiment and break things, putting real world scenarios to the test. In academia, more research ties with industry and government, including scholarships for business doctoral degrees with a focus on technology leadership. For those of us who wish to use our research to solve business problems, to solve government problems, and return back to community with those solutions. So I'll continue to advocate for individuals who haven't had a voice in the process, but it's past time to change the myth that only those who look like Silicon Valley CEOs are capable of developing world-class, life-saving, life-changing, and revolutionary technology. And I'll add this as I close. It feels as if business owners are going at it alone, with the wrong type of competition being established, meaning competing for finite resources, instead of a competition set by how we can collectively and quickly get a product or service out into the marketplace. And as I close, I want to express my gratitude to this commission for this opportunity and for making accommodations for me to deliver my testimony from here in Minnesota. I sincerely hope that something I said will contribute to a more equal and fair outcome for small business owners like myself who have creative ideas for the use and development of technology. Remove the obstacles, provide room for discovery, refine competition measured by collaboration and sustainable support, and watch a new generation of technology arrive that is best for the world and best in the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for that very compelling testimony and for highlighting an issue that we have not explored yet. So I appreciate that very much. So I'm going to open it up for the commission for questions for Elizabeth.
If there are no questions, I'm okay with that.
No, there's questions.
Oh.
So, okay, you go first, Dr. Gill. Did you have your hand up? Sorry.
Say hi, Elizabeth. Good to see you. As far as targeting investments, in research and innovation, do you have any specific recommendations for how that can best be done and really sort of get out of the typical loopholes of Silicon Valley investments?
Yeah, I mentioned it briefly in my testimony. I really do believe in the power of labs. I really do believe in investing in places where community leaders, technology leaders, have a place to go to test out their concepts without going at it alone. I speak with a lot of small business owners who are working through accelerators or trying to connect through SBIR programs, like I mentioned, but it still feels like an individual kind of journey. And that's what I loved about being in this lab environment, which is where all of these technology providers could benefit from each other's best practices. And while there might have been a little bit of competition, the competition really was, how can we get the best product out the door and into the marketplace as quickly as possible, and not really competing for, like I said, finite resources.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Any other questions for Elizabeth, or if not, we'll move on to, is Swati with us?
I was on here a few seconds ago.
Oops.
Oops. Done now.
Did we lose Elizabeth? Oh, there you are. Sorry.
I'm
You're
still
back.
here. I thought you were moving on.
Well, yeah, we're trying to find our fourth panelist in the ether out there. So to make sure we have about 10 minutes left, we want to give her make sure she has her allocated time. But is she? Have we?
I do hope you get to hear from Swati. I know her. She is a colleague. And yeah, she is an excellent technologist and CTO.
Well, we can keep talking to you while we wait. How's that?
Sure, I love that.
So you basically framed a situation where you, at least in part of your remarks, you talked about how there's programs out there that could, that perhaps were well-intentioned to address this problem, but they become very cumbersome to access. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Let's talk first about diversity and supplier programs. So here in Minnesota, we have lots of big companies. We have 3M, we have Best Buy, we have General Mills, we have Target, and we have a number of others. Each one of those diversity and supplier programs have their own unique requirements to get through. And there are also people on the other end who may not understand the power of technology or may not understand how communities, specifically those that represent communities of color or vulnerable populations, really do have a different way of looking at technology solutions. And so that's been part of my particular challenge, is finding and navigating a way to get into some of these organizations. If we think about the accelerator programs, again, many of them do help some folks, specifically business owners that I know that have products. But when you have a service, or maybe you want to pilot some sort of a technology, again, there are gatekeepers, or there are people that are a part of that accelerator program that are trying to sell their services. So they might come in and be a guide for the 10 or 12 weeks. And then you have to kind of pay them, whether it's for marketing or something else. And so you still end up trying to figure out how to bootstrap your idea, how to kind of get your idea off the ground. And so those are just a few of the challenges. And then I'll add one more on the SBIR website, which I was really excited about and actually had hoped to partner with someone who can help me navigate it. What I realized is that there are RFPs or projects out there, and if your particular technology does not fit within that, so most of what I do is to help leaders. Most of what I do is to help executives and policymakers kind of understand the tenets of responsible AI. There really isn't a place for that. And so I'm having personal challenges with trying to navigate the best way. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Any other questions? We have a couple minutes. Any other questions for Elizabeth or?
Small follow-up
Adam,
on
sure.
that. Just a quick follow-up on that question. You specifically mentioned the sort of burdens associated with SBIR program and similar types of efforts. Maybe you could elaborate. I'm not sure if everyone knows what SBIR is, but you might want to mention that and how you think that could work better.
Sure. It's a small business innovation research program, which I do believe is spectacular. Don't get me wrong. But going out to the website, there's a lot of information. So remember, I'm a small business owner. I'm trying to figure out how to get funding for my idea. I've already tried to navigate other avenues. And I come to SBIR, which I think is a fascinating effort, but there's the onus on me to try and figure out which particular AI technology or responsible technology my particular idea fits in. I also need to find someone who can help me navigate through that process. And I do believe that there are people that do that. And so it's this retrofitting. There really isn't a place that allows us to explore and kind of break things. It's all kind of already figured out for you, and you have to fit within that kind of confine. Hope that makes sense. And I guess what I'll say is that I think we're missing out on the opportunity for many people with great ideas who could possibly, like I said, produce technology that's best in the world and best for the world. But we have to kind of fit within these confines. And I think that there's just an opportunity to allow for more exploration while you are growing and while you are collaborating with other business owners and leveraging the resources of the government, industry, and academia as well.
Great. Well, again, thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I think we'll finish up this session a couple minutes early. I don't think we'll have a protest over that.
We'll get back on schedule.
You're right. That's right. So, okay, let's take a break and resume at 2 o'clock here. Thank you. All right, so we'll start our next time block here. We have 4 panelists, which we appreciate very much. Thank you for being here. I think we've got 2 here now and 2 coming. I don't think we have any virtual this time, do we?
No, not this.
No. Probably only 3 on this.
Oh, actually, just
David.
did it too in person.
David's not coming. Okay, so we have 3. So why don't we plan on, spending 10 to 15 minutes each, maybe spend half your time on testimony, and then give us an opportunity to ask some questions, because we've got a wonderful commission here, present company excluded, who will undoubtedly have probing and smart questions to ask. So we can keep this pretty informal. Charlie, I understand you have a time deadline, so can we start with you?
Appreciate that.
Yeah, sure.
Certainly have 15 minutes to chat through. Thank you very much for having us come in today. My name is Charlie Burgoyne. I'm the founder of a company in town called Valkyrie. In short, you can think of us as a modern day Bell Labs. Top physicists, mathematicians, statisticians brought into one lab. We solve problems for services engagements, and then we also have our own collection of investment vehicles. So, my personal training started as a teenager working at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. I'm a gamma ray burster as a physicist. Evolved into the operational CI. Basically, I was an operative for a number of years for an intelligence group. And since then, went into the private sector, developed machine learning teams and labs for different organizations, product design, Rosetta Stone, Air Force Research Labs before starting to operate. In short, this is actually a really fascinating topic for us to think about being practitioners in the space of machine learning and artificial intelligence. Because of the intentionally rigid dichotomy between innovation and protection of privacy. This is a problem we deal with regularly. We've got clients on the commercial side who are constantly thinking about new features that should be augmented into their digital services, and then defense clients and intelligence clients who are constantly trying to do the exact opposite. So where our philosophy really resides is balancing innovation for the sake of growth with as much governance and altruism guiding that growth as possible, while still maintaining a high fidelity on privacy associated with that. And I have a tactical example that hopefully will resonate. A couple of years ago, Fitbit became a thing, and now a lot of us are tracking our steps throughout the day. Now, the data itself, and living in its own unobstructed state, is pretty non-invasive. Like, how many steps did you take during the day? Not really that interesting. But it's been proven time and time again that Fitbit's relatively adept team of scientists are able to commingle those data with other auxiliary sets that are able to give them insights that are extremely invasive. For example, they worked with an insurance company to provide Fitbits for the sake of the health of a number of their customers. And they were able to show correlations between the gait of somebody's steps and things like whether or not they were obese, likelihood of them needing a knee replacement, whether or not they suffer from pulmonary disorders. This is actually a really fascinating state for this data to be in, right? Unadorned is really innocuous, but when you subtly add additional sets, all of a sudden the problem gets much more complicated. In the first state, before we commingle these data, you see a company that's developing features for the health of their customers and their populace. Suddenly, when you start commingling it with other things, now you see real threats to national security, consumer protection, even ways further exacerbating certain systemic inequalities and challenges that exist for private people. This is a real problem. But at the same time, you can't overreact to that and stipulate that data must exist in the singular space without any kind of commingling with other sets, because that's exactly how Fitbit develops new features. Fitbit depends on the ability to, and Fitbit exists really only as a thought experiment here. It's not an actual testimony around the nature of Fitbit's business model. But it's very emblematic of the way folks in the digital services space think about data. Fitbit's business model depends on them being able to develop features, outpace competitors like Apple and Garmin, all sorts of, a whole plethora of different folks. And those features need to be able to resonate with the customers for whom they serve. So it may be very possible that you'd like to know if you're going to be diabetic in 15 years based on the cadence of your steps. Very likely a lot of consumers would be very interested in that. But the problem is that they can't make that, they can't determine that for you without all of a sudden entering into the nuances of data governance and restrictions. They do not all of a sudden want to be governed by HIPAA or different types of consumer protection acts, while at the same time being really timid about how they push innovation. We see globally, and we spend a lot of time involved in supporting the defense and intelligence space, we see globally that the relationship a nation state has with their data and innovation and AI specifically be very emblematic of more macro cultural components of their governance. For example, in China, the right to privacy is not respected or thought of nearly the same way it is in the United States. And for that reason, gargantuan amounts of very finite, very invasive data is collected on behalf of features that are developed for products. There are many cell phone providers, for example, who actually just give their phones away for free, and the stipulation that all assets on the phone, all sensors on the phone are turned on at all times. On the other side of the pendulum, Western Europe has ostensibly decided that innovation is not worth the risk of privacy. And they've developed a number of different types of legislative acts, including things like GDPR, which on the table sounded really good. Let's protect a bunch of consumers from having their data used in ways that they did not anticipate at the outset. What they accidentally did was completely it totally destroyed the innovative groups of people who were pushing for different ways of utilizing machine learning and data in novel approaches, i.e. it destroys Fitbit's version 2.0 and version 3.0 when you're unable to use data in a way that it wasn't explicitly stated from the outset. And they've accidentally created so much white noise when putting people through different types of cookie settings and acceptances that now we're totally immune to any Western Europe-based website and the protections they're trying to procure. So it's a real pickle. We don't want to spur innovation domestically at the expense of privacy, but we also need to be able to remain competitive against adversaries who don't operate under the same character calculus that we do, principal calculus that we do. So where Valkyrie sits is we believe strongly that advocacy at the federal level for intelligent regulations is probably the appropriate step to take. We actively work with folks on the Hill as well as in the executive branch to try and identify different ways in which the proliferation of this field, which is unequivocally going to be the basis for all types of engagements that are non-kinetic for the United States moving forward. How do we retain dominance, especially against adversaries that, one, in China, that can throw large numbers of people at the particular problem, and Russians, who, because of very interesting nuances that I would be happy to discuss later on over at an armchair with a bottle of scotch, talking about why they are fundamentally better at this than we are. So yes, with that, I'm happy to dive into any of these things with more questions or to answer or field any of your more generic questions about our perspective.
The one thing I would say is I'm certain there'll be a lot of questions for you right now, Charlie. So Adam, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you for your testimony. It was really excellent. You're stressing the sort of fundamental tension between this conflict of vision we have between a model like China's and a model like the EU's. We don't want to be either of those. Finding some sort of a sensible middle ground or intelligent regulation is a challenge for all of us. Towards that end, there's been a huge number of frameworks set forth in recent years by professional trade associations, academics, business groups. The Chamber has a pretty good model of best principles. I don't know if you've spent time looking into these sort of best practices or guidance documents for IEEE, for example, has one called Ethically Aligned Design, which was 230 some pages of recommendations, but it's just one of many now. And I'm wondering, are those frameworks a helpful sort of hybrid model between those two poles? Could they be the basis of intelligent regulation, or should they remain a form of what others have called soft laws, sort of like informal operational principles for AI governance?
My personal perspective is that it's the latter case. So these are good operational guidelines as opposed to the basis for future regulation. My thought on that is because it's very easy to balance the pendulum at a high level in the vacuum, almost as an altruistic motivation. But when you actually start digging in tactically to what that particular IEEE standard means, it does unintentionally prohibit a number of different types of innovations that we're going to be dependent on. So I think I'm a big believer in the value of a truly free and open market with some degree of governance of the periphery. And I think that really by just the articulation of how experiments are being conducted, not necessarily the regulation of those, letting the market decide who should win or loss based on those practices is probably the right approach. TLDR, in short, I think that it's probably more appropriate use of our time to be focusing on the guidelines and then encouraging direct transparency, even if those guidelines aren't capable of acting. And we have a good friend of mine's a Navy pilot, and they always joke that the Air Force has a manual this large for what they're allowed to do. Navy has a manual this large about what they're not allowed to do, right? And that's probably why Navy has the best pilots in the world. I would contend that we would be much better off just outlining a small handful of guidelines of things that we're not allowed to do in order for us to preserve our competitive edge.
Do you think about privacy differently? Because I think about privacy around expectations and understanding, right? People have certain expectations, are they reasonable or not? And how much understanding do they have in terms of what they're engaging in? And it seems to me there's a difference between how privacy relates to adults and children. How do you think about that?
I think we happen to just have survived the last 24 months, a monumental shift in the idea of privacy, a societal control-alt-delete, the ramifications of which we aren't going to fully appreciate for quite a while. That is to say that leading up to the pandemic, there was already a bifurcation of mentalities around privacy between, I would say, millennials and for the latter half of the Gen Xers and Gen Zs, and then the first half of the Gen Xers all the way through boomers and beyond. That relationship with privacy fundamentally shifted because of the exposure, I think, to digital capabilities. And now individuals are very, very comfortable exposing all sorts of, I would say folks that are 50 and younger right now are very comfortable exposing immense amounts of what would traditionally be considered extremely private data on behalf of services. And that is a transaction that was at first not articulated directly. Companies like Alphabet exploited the fact that and hid the fact that really you were exposing data for the sake of transactions, advertisements. But even now that it's been exposed, I think people are very comfortable with that. They don't mind. Right? TikTok is a really great example of this application of that is YouTube. The way their business model shift to be explicitly tied to your relationship with those ads, even going as far as directly asking you about your relationship with the advertisements that are based off of your very private data. The other thing that happened was that to pair that, the pandemic also served as a major catalyst for us to change our relationship with digital services in general. If you had told me 3 years ago that we would be having regular doctor's visits digitally, that I would be performing the plurality of my commerce digitally, even going as far as not interacting with my grocery store directly anymore, crazy. But the reality is that while we will bounce back a lot of those behaviors, to some degree, that it's hard to put that together.
They were happening, it was just accelerated.
I think so, a major catalyst, yeah.
But you don't, well, I was really getting at children who are engaging with technology. Do you think that there's a different set of standards around privacy for them?
Privacy is not an inherent, it is not inherently appreciated. It has to be instilled, much like many of the other liberties that we indulge in. So if the culture around privacy is shifting with the parent culture,
right, it's going to shift with the kids.
It's going to shift with the children, further exacerbating some of the issues that we're seeing with that lack of appreciation of that.
So can I?
Yes.
So that's a question or more comment. And maybe there's a question anyway. So I really appreciate your discussion of the cultural dependence of people, of how culture determines technology evolution in different countries like EU versus China in terms of privacy. I guess I'm curious, maybe there's a way of reframing the tension between innovation and regulation, that, as you put it, like when I think about GDPR, I see the burden it put on companies, the amount of money they spend to comply with GDPR, but I also see them as fostering an ecosystem that got researchers that thinking more carefully about what it means to have explainable models. Like before GDPR, there was a conversation about interpretability. GDPR asks sort of without requiring interpretability, and all of a sudden you have this wellspring of research around things we care about. We want to make our models interpretable. So I don't necessarily see that regulation was hampering innovation in the way you brought it across. So I'm thinking, as long as a culture cares about, for example, privacy, explainability, regulation can sort of can improve our ability to address that cultural requirement. And yeah, that's the primary. I guess I'm wondering how rigid you think that tension between innovation and regulation is.
Respectfully, I don't think that we can assume that interpretability is actually an altruism that we should be pursuing. The majority, I would say majority, a good selection of the models that we depend on right now to be competitive against our peers and their peers are dependent entirely on deep neural networks, which have no interpretability. The question is, do we want to be able to further differentiate our industries by giving them advantages? Being able to have R squares that are 3 points higher than a traditional or canonical model that doesn't have it, that has explicit interpretability. Or do we want to pursue an altruism that may actually not have any desired outputs with the outset? Really, the majority of, I sit and eat, sleep, and breathe this, and I have since I was a teenager. The majority of the biases that are introduced that either perpetuate or dismantle some of the challenges that we're trying to address with things like GDPR are introduced to the biases of the data themselves, not the interpretability necessarily of the models. That's a major, in my mind, that's a major component for GDPR that was missed, not focusing instead on the introduction of those biases before they're brought in for their studies.
How would that, sorry.
Oh, keep going. I think Charles you got like 2 more minutes, I understand. So,
I mean, how would that, how would you have preferred GDPR to address the question of bias? Like, I assume the data is mostly socially generated and pre-poisoned in the first place.
It's a great example from our own portfolio. We worked with Mercedes-Benz a number of years ago, supporting an effort they had for public transportation to be democratized more freely in the city of Portland. They gave us data on which routes were utilized by buses and trains, and they asked us to come back with ways we could optimize different locations for people to be picked up and to serve different communities. Now, the models we developed had proficiency, both the canonical approaches and the deep learning, the deep neural networks, which are not attributable. They both had pretty strong performance, slightly better for the deep learning network. But what made a much bigger difference is when we realized that they only developed an iOS app. Anybody who spends a lot of time in the city, especially with the underserved communities that don't have access to private transportation, would know that they're not all walking around with iPhones. That's actually something that that's a major problem. It's a major miss. So if we were to account for the discrepancies between the services and the biases that were perpetuated by the tools that Mercedes had us come and evaluate, unequivocally, the overwhelming majority of the issues that were generated from that were from the biases introduced by the data coming from non-Android and iOS itself.
Is that a concern that's addressable through regulation, or just making sure that people developing actually are developing with the right intention? Like, it's not something you can regulate or anything, right?
You really can't regulate it, especially because it's so domain. It's not even sector dependent, it's subsector dependent. It's maybe department dependent organization. The problem is that fundamentally we do not develop systems, models, capabilities where the people who are developing the models and thinking about those problems are paired up and graded to the people who have collected this data. That fundamental disconnection creates some of these vast unintentional biases. And so nobody at Mercedes-Benz said we're going to try and go disenfranchise anybody. The person who was developing the app for the collection of data, the people who were doing the data curation, the people who were developing the models were all sitting in different spaces. So we have to think about having individuals who can be privately regulated by the companies themselves, who can think of it, essentially act as good stewards of those data as they traverse through the ecosystem. It's probably the only way we can really address the problem. And they're incentivized to do that too. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about the market. Mercedes-Benz wants to do the right thing, both from an altruism standpoint and from a capitalist standpoint.
Follow-up question. What's your best example of that pairing of domain knowledgeable stakeholders and developers? Have you seen examples where that worked really well, and is there a model that you can maybe sell us on that?
That's a good question. Years ago, I worked with the United Nations on a health data exchange platform to basically create a tool where refugee camps could catalog and track different types of ailments that were spreading throughout the space and the availability of resources. This singular dashboard was designed in a very novel approach. I'm not a designer, but I was working closely with the design team. It was designed such that there was a single interaction model for the doctors, for the patients, for the administrators of the refugee camp, and then also the media. So this is supporting some operations that were going on in Syria, and then later we reutilized that material for South Sudan. I think that creating a degree of transparency not only of the raw data itself, but how those data are being interpreted by different factions within the same body. That's a very powerful tool in trying to remediate some of these issues.
Well, thank you, Charlie.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Okay, Catherine, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm not sure how you follow that, but I will do my best. Just be patient. I have not been studying this since I was.
Well, you are from Google after all.
I am from Google though. I represent a lot of people that have been studying this since they were teenagers.
So thank you for being with us.
Distinguished commissioners, thank you for allowing Google to participate in this important discussion. We look forward to supporting the work of the commission and welcome an opportunity to share our learnings with public servants working on AI governance and oversight in the public sector. As background, I support Google's public policy in the southern United States, based in Texas. We're proud to employ over 2,000 Googlers in our growing Austin, Houston, Dallas offices and our data center in Midlothian. Our corporate engineering, global recruiting, cloud, and YouTube trust and safety teams are proud to call Texas a home state. Google seeks to use science and technology to significantly improve the lives of people around the world. In Texas and across the globe, AI has significant potential to help and solve challenging problems, including by advancing medicine, understanding language, and fueling scientific discovery. Google uses AI across a number of products and services, including search to understand search queries, obviously, translate through instant camera translations and improve translation accuracy, Play Store to assist customers in app discovery, Gmail and our smart reply and spam filtering functions, and cloud to help us run more efficient and sustainable data centers, provide app development without coding, and automate document processing. Even in photos through image search, suggested sharing, and color pop that uses AI to detect the subject of a photo and leave them in color while changing the background to black and white. To realize AI's full potential, it's critical that AI is used and developed responsibly. Alongside industry, academia, civil society, and others, policymakers play a critical role in providing a balanced, fact-based analysis of the opportunities and challenges presented by AI, reflecting views across diverse disciplines, perspectives, and walks of life. Google aspires to create technologies that solve the important problems and help people in their everyday lives. We're optimistic about the incredible potential for AI and other advanced technologies to empower people and widely benefit current and future generations. We believe that these technologies promote innovation and further our mission to organize the world's information. Here's where y'all are interested. We recognize that these same technologies also raise important challenges that we need to address clearly, thoughtfully, and affirmatively. To that end, we've established principles in 2018 that guide Google AI applications, best practices to share our work with communities outside of Google, and programs to operationalize our efforts. Our AI principles reflect our commitment to develop technology responsibly and establish specific application areas we will not pursue. Our recently released AI transparency report outlines many of our internal considerations. You can reference our principles and the transparency report at ai.google. At Google, a central team is dedicated to putting our AI principles into practice. These teams review new and AI advancing technologies before launch, working with internal domain experts in machine learning fairness, security, privacy, human rights, and the social sciences, and for cultural context, Google's own employee resource groups. We believe these principles are the right foundation for our company and the future development of AI. We acknowledge that this area is dynamic and evolving, as alluded, and we recognize that our approach with you, and that we recognize, I lost my place. It happens. We acknowledge that this area is dynamic and evolving, and we will approach our work with humility and a commitment to internal and external engagement and a willingness to adapt our approach as we learn over time. There's also significant opportunity for government engagement in promoting responsible AI growth. Indeed, AI can and has helped government services work better. Whether it's administering unemployment benefits more efficiently or providing communities with authoritative information about COVID-19 vaccines, these practical applications of AI ease rote work and deliver better outcomes for the public at large. AI can support agencies by processing paperwork, digitizing claims requests, and automating rote tasks such as reviewing applications, allowing state agencies to operate more efficiently and cost-effectively. AI can also help create interactive chatbots in call centers to free up civil servants' time and allow constituents to get quick answers to common questions, and then connect customers with a human agent for more sophisticated tasks. AI can also help get through paperwork when applying for assistance after a natural disaster. Speed processes like licensing, qualifying to bid, and other paperwork-intensive work. Using practical results-oriented AI means better served constituents and a more effective, cost-effective service delivery. These are critical and positive outcomes for delivering better government services. We're very proud of the work we have done to create technologies that solve problems and help people in their daily lives. We are optimistic about the incredible potential for AI and other advanced technologies to empower people, widely benefit current and future generations, and work for the common good. We appreciate the work of this commission and look forward to working with you as you seek to address the challenges and opportunities for the adoption of artificial intelligence within our society. At this point, I'll conclude formal remarks and would be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Well, thank you for your testimony, Catherine. Questions?
Google operates pretty much around the world, and you have direct relationships with, I don't know, what percentage of humanity. How does Google go about reconciling cultural differences, not legal differences, but cultural differences around the use of data by people?
That's a very important question and one we take very, very seriously. I mentioned the common good multiple times in my testimony. We believe it's our responsibility to do that, quite frankly. And many of our AI practices that are now principles or operations that are now entering into further society through private businesses or governments, we triple, quadruple, they're under deep, deep review to ensure that their quality of fairness, biasness, I've got my list. We believe it's our duty to ensure the quality and accuracy and unbiasedness of those applications in considering those factors. So we have actually hundreds of people on that team internally that reviews those before they even are released. I don't know if that answers your question.
Can I?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, just one couple of questions actually. You talked about principles of AI in 2018, and you said you actually have certain things that you cannot do, right? Can you give a couple of examples of what you had on mind when you said that?
So we actually have the full list available on our website with detailed explanations of each.
You do, perfect.
Yeah, detailed, very explicit.
And the second thing, I understand how you talked about privacy, which is great. And this is a question I'm asking more from an individual user of Google and several other areas. Many companies usually want us to opt in by default and opt out specifically if I don't want the data to be seen. On the other hand, I personally felt, hey, why can't I just have an opt out? Don't use any of my data. If I want to, I will let you know when I want you to. Because the default position is people don't read everything, they just go with the flow. Has Google thought about this, or have you thought about privacy from that perspective, where on one end you have people who would say, I would rather you not use my data unless I opt in. On the other hand, you just kind of take everybody else along the way, right? You just take the data. I'm just curious what your position would be on that.
I'll be honest and say that I'm here to speak about AI and not privacy, but opt-in features are definitely a major consideration in ongoing legislation across the country. We believe that our systems are built to maintain personal privacy and disclose those items that are used as data sets and give ultimate opportunity and discretion on transparency on what is collected and give that opt-out option. So I think that that's an ongoing conversation that is hard to address on federal scale.
Thank you.
So following up on Jerry's point about the fact that Google is a multinational company and paying attention to the fact that the commission also includes questions around competitiveness for the United States. What's Google's perspective on supporting the United States being competitive relative to, say, China or Russia? Is that something y'all stay out of completely, or is that, any thoughts you can offer us on that?
Again, I'm really excited to be here speaking about AI, but as far as foreign policy is concerned, we're very excited to be an American company and respect the laws of the US, and operations with other countries are definitely important, but not one that I'm qualified to speak on behalf of right now.
What type of regulation would Google welcome in terms of AI, if any?
We believe that it's very important. Actually, Sundar himself wrote an article several years ago that said AI is too important not to regulate. We believe very firmly that our principles that we established in 2018 are very effective now and then and going forward. A model based on or reflecting both, I will say we're honored that a lot of regulatory proposals have reflected a lot of the Google principles that we have self-regulated for the last several years.
So meaning you would hope those principles would be translated into regulations across the board that would apply to the companies?
I would absolutely say that we're comfortable and we, for our practices, believe that the model written, and again, open to continuous adjustment, we believe that it is effective for regulating AI.
Do you have a preference on whether it's a hard form of regulation or whether it's like a industry-wide softer form of regulation? If we take the content of what Google's principles, would you prefer it on the government side or self-governance across industries or not?
I think self-governance has been a very effective method of regulating AI for a long time as a capitalist company, but there are incredible opportunities for nefarious uses of AI if it's not. So I do think it's very important that the federal government takes a look at this and applaud the U.S. Chamber and the chairman for addressing this topic.
Can I follow up on what?
Of course.
So when we talk about hard regulation at the level of the federal government, there's definitely going to be an element of a stick. Like we want people to do certain things, and if they don't, there'll be a stick. Do you have thoughts on what is acceptable as a stick in this case? Like GDPR has those large fines, and I don't know how we can have good regulation without something like a stick.
I'm going to get a little bit legislative wonky here, but the definition of a shall or a may is at the discretion of a lot of policymakers, and it will be a definite consideration. I think the framework and consideration of what is regulated is more important.
Google is involved in a lot of different AI battles, if you will, and we're talking very high level here, but in the weeds of other issues like autonomous systems, driverless cars, UASs, things like this. Maybe you could give us a feel for how you think those issues are unfolding and what principles we would like to see guide those efforts.
Honestly, all of those rely into this conversation here directly with AI, and that's our internal principles and the internal team of hundreds of members that review every single bet or product area in our operation. I mentioned just a few of the examples, but autonomous vehicles or search or photos, all of them fall under many of them, fall under some sort of consideration of AI development that we apply our principles to from the foundation.
The question I had, just to follow up on your position of less regulation here. One thing is that, definitely regulation as a sticker, I got that. But several of the prior speakers, they said how information from one company or one industry, then clubbed with the information from another company or other industry could be valuable, right? Would you then say a regulation to allow for purposeful value-added sharing of information across companies is actually a good regulation?
I can't speak to the regulatory components of that, but as a foundational principle of Google, we are very open source. We published a transparency report in November that outlines very detailed working systems of how we establish our AI and our protocols. So I think sharing is critical in this discussion, absolutely.
Thank you.
One of the things that we've gone into with many of the folks that have been here today is the availability of data. And clearly Google has access to one of the world's largest accumulations of data, without any doubt about it. And it's a tremendously valuable asset for Google. It could also be a tremendous asset for society at large. Does Google have a stance on the interoperability of data? In other words, being able for an individual to be able to gather back all of the data that they have entrusted to Google, get it back and give it to another enterprise across all of your entities?
I believe that's a little bit more of a privacy question than I'm prepared to answer or able to answer right now. But I will say that complete data sets or robust data sets are very critical to the development of AI. And that's a major factor in considering the biases that you referenced to earlier. Trying to gather as much accurate information as possible is what is the key, is a key to essentially ensuring unbiased in the processing of AI.
Catherine, thanks for being here today. Thanks for your testimony. Let me just ask you a question as a human being, right? Like I think about a lot of these.
I'm still wearing a Google name.
Yeah, of course, right? Well, I mean, we all come to these questions with our own, life experience and point of view. I mean, I think of so many of these issues as a dad, right? I've got kids. I see the way technology and in many cases AI has impacted their lives and opportunities that they have, things that can be done now that couldn't be done when I was their age. It's both thrilling and terrifying, right? Just as a person, you work for this incredible technology company. What about the things that we're talking about maybe as a human being sort of most excite you and maybe most frighten you about the possibilities that are out there with this type of powerful tool? I like to talk to my kids about, whether it's technology or the internet or anything else, it's an incredibly powerful tool. It's like a chainsaw, okay? When it's used properly, it is so incredibly helpful and saves so much time and energy and effort. When used improperly, it can be devastating, right? I try to help my kids think about these issues in both ways. Is there any of that? I mean, you're on the inside of this amazing technology company. How do you think about these things?
As a mother of a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old.
Yeah, there you go.
I very much appreciate the opportunities and challenges presented by some of the emerging technology. I think we've outlined it specifically in Sundar said it himself. AI is too important not to regulate. And Google, as an organization, very much tries to meet the needs and enhance the lives of users, addressing challenges and problems. I would say that we are not able to do it all by ourselves, and that's why we absolutely support you as leaders in our federal government to identify the needs of our constituents and represent moms like me outside of the corporation in those considerations. Are there risks? Absolutely. And we're aware of those. And we've set our principles and established our transparency report to mitigate those as much as possible. There are things that we don't develop for that reason, because of the potential risks of those. Are there benefits? They absolutely are. I think the idea that you can take a picture that's on your phone and it identifies a person in a party and can put the party in the background and the person in the front, and if I'm wearing a red shirt, my red shirt will show, is unbelievable. I mean, just some of the technologies that are available now in this field just are mind-boggling and incredible. I do believe strongly that they have the opportunity to enhance society, solve challenges, enhance government operations, speed responses, and a lot of other solutions. Change medical history.
Other questions? Well, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you all for
We
the
really
opportunity.
appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
All
for
right, I
going.
think we have another break here.
All right, it's 3 o'clock. We're going to begin our final panel for the day. My co-chair, Congressman Delaney, had to catch a flight, so that's why we worked it out. So I did the first panel on the fourth, so you did the two in the middle. So thanks, everybody. We have a great panel for our fourth panel, 4 great witnesses, and then we're going to have some closing remarks at the end. So we're going to do our best to stay on schedule. First of our afternoon final panel is Austin Carson. Austin is the founder and CEO of Seed AI. Right. All right, 10 minutes, please. Share with us your thoughts, and if we have time, we'll do some Q&A as well.
I appreciate it. I just got off the plane, so this might be a little rougher. All right. My name is Austin Carson. As you said, I am the founder and president of Seed AI, which is a nonprofit that I founded for the purpose of building up AI resources for communities around the United States, specifically focused upon local development of AI capacity in the form of data and compute and educational resources, training resources, and then the talent around it, as well as the creation of ecosystems to support that, including academia, including representation groups, including local NGOs, large and small businesses. And so, sorry to zoom in completely. Come on. And so, I came into doing this job because I used to work at NVIDIA, which makes one of the primary components for AI compute. For those of you that aren't aware, I imagine all of you are, so I'm sorry, I'm just something else. And so over the course of a 3-year period of time, we worked on a project that the co-founder partially funded because he graduated from the University of Florida to build the most powerful academic supercomputer. I think maybe second most powerful academic supercomputer in the world at the time at the University of Florida. Hypergator 3, it's like 1,200 NVIDIA, like cutting edge A100s, like 700 TF16s, some crazy stuff. And so around that process, they had the state of Florida put in like $500 million, and they hired a bunch of different AI researchers, some educators who could do an AI across the curriculum project, and started working on connective tissue with the other parts of the university system for taking that AI across the curriculum and translating it to things like art school, business school, and community colleges, getting down to some of this more kind of application layer stuff. And so it became at least pretty reasonably probable to me that there was a template modular way in which you can take a lot of the policy goals that we have, which is increasing equity and representation, increasing overall AI capacity in the United States, in kind of more local and national and international competitiveness, opening up entirely new markets. I mean, I would make the statement that even if you stop, there's a question asked on a panel I was at recently, which was, what do you say about the hype, right? When people go on about AI and all the things that you can say about the hype, it's like, I'll be very hopeful and unhelpful simultaneously, right? The unhelpful part is that the hype is incredibly reasonable, right? Is that there are even if you had zero new, and I said this even before, like Google's multimodal, model came out, and then they started having all the different no-code systems. The very beginning of that, which is, you all know, has expanded substantially. And it's like, even if we had no new technological development, we have like 5% of what we have applied right now, right? There's just this endless pool of unknown data of people that aren't able to participate right now, purely because we can't get this application, them into this layer of application space, instead of it being all about the same thing with computer science, which is focusing purely upon the actual kind of AI developers and AI coders, right? And so looking at that as a model, I spent a lot of time talking to people in Congress, talking to people in the administration, talking to researchers, largely through the guise of working with NVIDIA and the University of Florida. But as time went on, I just got kind of consumed by this idea that we didn't do something to strategically increase availability of resources and training and opportunity, right? Moving into a rhetorical space, opportunity and participation to pretty much define where your future goes, considering that's going to be largely defined by artificial intelligence. And I ask communities what they want, take their strengths and amplify them and help people amplify them with this technology. And so I want to read a couple just statistics that I pulled up or that I found when we did some polling. When I kicked off the organization, we commissioned a poll from Morning Consult, which is $1 million, very reputable entity, if you're not aware, that does partnerships with like ESPN, New York Times, and Amazon. They're kind of the macro polling guys. But did like a plus or minus 2% poll all across the country on people's sentiment around artificial intelligence. Adults across ideologies, 59% of liberals, 51% of moderates, 5% of conservatives. So they would be more likely to approve of their representatives in Congress if they were to commit to investing in AI technology development and job training. 3/4 of millennials and Gen X adults said that they would be more interested in learning about AI if there was an opportunity to do so in their local community. 61% of baby boomers agree. Nearly half of all adults say that the U.S. were to invest in developing AI technology, training workers for AI jobs, or educating students on how to use AI technology. 46%, 50%, 50%. They would be less worried about the potential negative consequences of greater AI adoption. And we have this huge list of what are all the concerns that you can possibly have about AI. There's like loss of agency, loss of creativity. Interestingly enough, the number one concern people have is the hackability of AI. 55% were concerned about that. And then finally, approximately 2/3 of adults definitely believe that private companies, their state's government, and the federal government should all work together to ensure AI is safe and trustworthy. So you would expect, I think, some ideological designs that there's some ideological divides there that people would not want the federal government to ensure diversity in a new kind of technological area. They wouldn't feel any differently about Biden. Biden had like a 22% swing in somewhat support if he would agree to do that. But the idea that there's anything that would make the polarized political environment turn on like that significant of a percentage, it's honestly amazing to me. And the methodologies on my website, there's like a full cross tabs if anybody wants to look through it, but it's very impressive. Okay, so I'm getting kind of long here and I have way too many more points. So maybe I'll let you guys, I'll make a couple quick other points. So first of all, if you look at conversations around investment or around building up ecosystems, like we can't just do AI here, right? It's not just like we can just suddenly have AI. And the point is, it's not like we're asking you to come in, we're asking anybody to develop a plan with the intent of suddenly becoming, MIT or CMU or like putting out the most cited AI research. I think the expectation is that each area has an existing set of industries and capabilities that if given the capacity, the assistance, again, you've got kind of this AI research resource that's at the research level that's very valuable as a kind of a core for this. But to expand that out into the broader population and take some of those democratizing technologies, you're going to be able to bring in this cross-disciplinary aspect of it and a much broader section of both the country and the population at large. Now, my final point I'll make on this is that I think that there's also a really important place for safety and validation on two sides of this plan, right? The first side is that in setting up systems, as you already know from working in academic environments, you have to have some type of use restrictions or some, if you're at NeurIPS, they're like, please guess what terrible thing might happen. We're not even going to ask you to fix it, but just guess what terrible thing might happen. So I think you can have these kind of internally competitive environments of how do you use this machine, how broadly or how narrowly, and how much do you allocate for different purposes, right? And then even on the federal funding side or on the federal policy side, I think there's a good argument to be made that we should, if we're going to build out a lot of infrastructure, make a significant portion of that dedicated to test beds, real world testing that can include people that are a little bit down the sophistication line on this. I see there's a lot of examples involving startups working with community colleges or working with historically Black colleges, universities, with other minority serving institutions, where one startup I know, Crowd.ai, is using their computer vision technology along with the pharmaceutical school to show them how they can apply that for the sake of keeping accurate counting of the medication itself. And so you're not, instead of having this environment where like things are being tested on people, instead of that, people are participating in testing a technology that they then have some ownership of and can then apply to things. So I know that there's a huge chasm between like developing the next most amazing large language model or something and then counting pills. But the unsexy stuff is where all the magic starts. Like this is this gigantic unsexy pile of opportunity that then gets very appealing as it continues to expand over time. So that's about half what I've written down, and I really don't want to take else for you guys because I can see it fade a little bit. If you want to ask me questions, or we can follow up.
A couple minutes for questions for Austin.
If there are no questions, can I ask you to expand a little bit about your vision of democratizing AI? What exactly is the point? Like, I have ideas, but I want to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, so two things. The first would be, I do think that the foundation of technology and the foundation of the way that society interacts is going to be largely dictated by artificial intelligence in the not distant future. There's going to be a layer of at least language processing that underlies everything. There's going to be these kind of components built on top of that, these huge marketplaces of tuned networks, and then all of that technology is going to get progressively more sophisticated, more accessible, right? So on one hand, you have an opportunity to democratize, which is exciting. On the other hand, all of those different technologies are going to have characteristics baked into the creators of those technologies, right? And so in my view, and there was a letter recently sent to OSDP and NSF that I gave a supporting quote for from the sponsors of the National AI Research Resource about how such democratized resources should also contribute proactively to the support, protection, and enhancement of human rights, right? And there's on two sides: A, from the testing, testbed, validation, understanding of technology in the field, and then B, from the fact that, again, it's a representation of whoever creates it, it's created to a large extent. And so in my view, the body of people creating artificial intelligence should look like the body of people that are going to be using artificial intelligence. And the final point is, there is a ton of stuff that we're not making because there's only so much shit that, random people that look mostly like me out on the West Coast and Massachusetts can make, you know? I mean, I only got so many ideas. People look like we have so many ideas. And you see it time and again, every time there's any expansion, you have a bunch of new cool things that happen.
So I asked that question because the refrain democratize AI is always loud and it's never clear exactly why people are asking for it. The last point you made about it, about AI being used to target problems that people on the ground care about, seems to me to be a very compelling point.
I wondered if you could expand just a little bit. You're talking about interdisciplinary approaches. What does that entail?
So I think there's two main models that I would throw out. The first is the AI institutes, which are being set up by NSF, where they have NSF and another department that are collaborating on a project. And like I was speaking to people at university yesterday, I had one focused on the Department of Agriculture, focused on, I think, crop yields, right? So they have a focus on a societal issue at core, and there's a list of what those issues are. Funding is moderate, but it exists. You know, I mean, I think that, so kind of where I'm coming from, a lot of those programs lack the infrastructure. Right? You have a 5-year program that has $20 million in aggregate funding. Much better than zero, right? But if you're going to do some of this sophisticated stuff, especially if it involves large-scale simulation, or if it involves any type of sophisticated, dense, or large kind of data pool neural network, you're going to be very limited on what you can pursue. So you're kind of funding, I think, more headcount than those things. That said, that's, I think, an unfounded opinion. So I'm gonna stop talking about that. I feel like I should ask somebody else that has more.
One more quick question for Austin before we keep going.
Yeah.
By the way, we do have one of the institutes here in UT, the Institute Foundation. So my question really is on, you said that there will be you think there will be marketplaces of pre-trained models or obviously data sets. There's a unique aspect of AI. Unlike, for example, when you talk about code, if I take some code from GitHub and I use it in my commercial product, it's clear that code is there. But one thing that happens with models is I can take a GPT model trained on some data, fine tune it, post that model, then somebody else takes that model, fine tunes it on their own data. And in fact, it's not even clear at all. We can even know what data sets have been touched in the making of a final model that somehow you may find in a marketplace. So I guess my question on that is, what do you think is, what would be a good regulation, or what would be good rules to set for this kind of?
That's a great question, because I talked about this for like 3 hours yesterday. Okay, so one thought is that you would have Filecoin has an idea of how to approach this, right? Which is that their cold storage is very expensive comparatively, and so if you're pre-training, you have a model and then you're going to retrain it, right? You're going to have this much smaller data set that kind of needs to be archived somewhere. So you could have a pretty much no-cost archive that could then be indexed, tagged to that, and then whenever that was retrained, so you would have this kind of, I mean, on the blockchain, I guess technically, but you could, in whatever format, have this kind of tagging and indexing thing over time, I think cost and labor is the most prohibitive factor, I'm presuming, over time. But first of all, there's some loss coming out. There's auditability in some way, sets of use, and maybe this fractal data set thing we're going to figure it out anyways. But I think we have a good opportunity to do so right now. Either A, in some, like a file bringing what they're anticipating or trying to figure out what to do. And another friend of mine at a startup called Column, which is aggregating and digitizing all public notice information. Spoke to them yesterday. They were interested in also figuring out a way to index this. How can you make sure that you do have that cascading data? Because again, I think about this, and let's talk about this more a couple days from now. Have you ever seen that old XKCD comic? It's like all the blocks, and then it's like this one little piece, and it's like this piece maintained by some thankless guy in Nebraska since 2007. It's like all digital infrastructure. You see the same scenario inevitably happening for artificial intelligence. There's going to be like the best model for X that's going to get out there, that's going to have 18 different retrained layers or whatever, however it works 5 years from now. Who knows? It works very differently every 6 months, right? And then something crazy is going to happen. It's going to randomly retrain on some other generated stuff, develop a weird mythology. We're not going to know how to deal with it. And so I think that's actually, I agree, it's a very critical point as well. But
Awesome.
much more time.
This is fascinating. So there's like 100 threads to pull on here. So I'm going to be the bad guy and try to keep us on schedule. But thank you very much. That was fascinating. Our next witness is Sherry Greenberg. Sherry is at the University of Texas, a professor of practice, fellow of Max Sherman Chair in State and Local Government. Sherry, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and good afternoon, commissioners. I'm also on the leadership team for Good Systems, which is one of 3 bridging barriers grand challenges at University of Texas at Austin. Very large multidisciplinary research teams. And Good Systems works to ensure that the needs and values of society drive the design of artificial intelligence technology. So that's the goal of it. AI-based technologies are helping us solve complex problems in nearly every discipline and industry, but they have the capacity to be harmful to us in ways we might not predict or intend. So we want to design AI technologies that benefit society, and that's our grand challenge, so to speak. AI is in our lives. People and AI can work better together than either can in isolation, given their distinct and complementary strengths and weaknesses. Also, though, there are unintended consequences. Technologists who develop AI do not always fully consider the possible ethical and societal implication of their designs. But likewise, we can have very reactive laws. Lawmakers and policymakers are not always equipped to understand AI's effects. So how can we ensure that advances in AI are compatible and responsive to the needs and values of society? I want to spend just a few moments speaking about an idea and actually a paper that I wrote with a colleague of mine, Ken Fleischman, who's a professor at the School of Information, for Day One project. It was published about a year ago, January of 2021. And we talked about fair artificial intelligence research and regulation, or otherwise we called it FAIR, F-A-I-R-R, Bureau. I know, how did that happen? So artificial intelligence is transforming our everyday reality, and it has the potential to save or cost lives. Innovation is advancing at breakneck pace. We know that, with technology developers engaging, though, in de facto policy setting through their decisions about the use of data and the embedded bias in their algorithms. Policymakers must keep up. Otherwise, policymakers are ceding decision-making authority to technologists. And as we know, we face rising threats all over the world to U.S. national security. We certainly know that more than ever today, unfortunately. To our economy, health, and again, probably know that more than ever today and beyond, as opposed by AI. So we need to be proactive in making policy recommendations. What FAIR would do is bring together experts in technology, human behavior, and public policy from all sectors, from the public, private, nonprofit, and academic sectors, to research and develop policies that enable the United States to leverage AI as a positive force for national security, economic growth, and equity. The FAIR Bureau would adopt interdisciplinary, evidence-based approach to AI regulation and policy needed to address these unprecedented challenges. AI-based technologies can be a matter of life or death, and we saw this with, for instance, the Boeing 737 MAX and those issues. Indeed, AI is becoming ubiquitous in the everyday lives of Americans, from transportation with autonomous vehicles to healthcare, which makes use of deep learning-based automation in radiology, for instance. Our national economic security could be enhanced or threatened by AI. AI is not really a single technology, but rather a family of technologies with manifold applications that can in turn lead to presenting unimaginable new technologies, as we just discussed. So we believe that the federal government should adopt a proactive rather than reactive approach in anticipating the potential risks of AI-based technologies. Given the high expectations of the American public for rapid, useful technological innovation, but also their skepticism and lack of trust, you have to earn that trust. You must be trustworthy, and then people earn that trust. And there is intense global competition in the technology sector, as we know. So given that, we are proposing establishing an agency, as I stated there, whose research mission would be modeled on the patient-centered outcomes that we have seen with PCOR created through the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and whose policy mission could be modeled on, for instance, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So we have models in the federal government. The FAIR Bureau would conduct research and evaluation and make policy recommendations for the federal government on AI applications. Additionally, the FAIR Bureau would serve as a coordinated multi-sector and interdisciplinary hub for education and outreach on the safe and equitable use of AI. The FAIR Bureau would centralize the federal government's activities potentially in AI and research and regulation through a strategic plan with a mission, vision, and core values that drive budget priorities. The Bureau would work with several federal agencies, for instance. In conclusion, given the immense life and death stakes of AI, there is need for evidence-based policymaking to depoliticize AI funding regulation. And like the prior speaker, I believe that that certainly is possible from surveys and research that have been done and from research that we have been doing. The FAIR Bureau would engage leading experts from across academia and cutting-edge research on the implications of AI to discuss its benefits and harms, and would also involve those from industry, nonprofit sector, and others, and then feed these findings into proactively regulating development and use of AI. Thus, the FAIR Bureau is needed to ensure that AI does not further concentrate inequities, and that it benefits all Americans with an emphasis on combating these systemic inequities and achieving justice for all. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Sherry, thanks for your research on this and citing the paper that you mentioned. And I think that's what we're looking for as ideas. Your FAIR Bureau is an interesting idea. We heard others from earlier witnesses. You talked about CFPB and other models that can be modeled on. Very, very interesting stuff. We have time for one question for Sherry. I'll be the bad guy. Yeah, go ahead.
So, taking reality as it is, and we have a system of government in the U.S. where we're having a hard time deciding that today is Thursday. And there seems to be a general consensus that AI should be regulated, but how in the world in a democratic country like the United States with as many people and as many divisions can government keep up with the pace of technology? And should the technologists be ceded the authority to regulate themselves under general ethical principles?
That's a good question. Clearly, we think that we should not just cede that ability to the technologists. I've been involved in policymaking in prior lives, and I've seen with different industries ceding self-regulation doesn't necessarily work. But that's why the model we're proposing would involve the technologists at the table, industry at the table, academia, government, everybody would have a seat at the table. And I think that's something that politically people on all sides believe in, and that if you give everyone a seat at the table, you will come out with the best results.
Sherry, thank you very much for your testimony. Thanks for being with us today. Our next witness is Sakshi Mishra. She's a senior autonomous systems engineer at Microsoft. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Members of the Artificial Intelligence Commission on Competitiveness, Inclusion, and my name is Aschalew. Thank you for the opportunity.
Actually, as you already heard, I'm the bad guy. Can I ask you to just speak a little bit louder? Because we're far away over here, just so we can make sure we're hearing everything you say. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. The views and opinions expressed in this testimony are my own and don't reflect those of my employer. As an applied AI researcher and practitioner, I have been witnessing the wave of AI's application in the broader technology sector from the front row view. The technological innovations based in AI have already started benefiting people around the world. My first-hand involvement in building its application in clean energy and electric mobility sectors have helped me comprehend how useful AI technology is for solving burning issues of the day. Today, industry, academia, and government are beginning to reach the consensus that the fast-paced and far-reaching changes from AI offer dynamic opportunities for improving environmental, economical, and social spheres of the nation. However, harnessing the full potential of the technology for the benefit of the nation also requires addressing the complex challenges, a bunch of them. And so today I want to talk about the labor market transition as one of the challenges, and it's a complex one. There are growing concerns that advances in AI have the potential to disrupt the labor markets by creating job displacements as this technology grows and becomes more prevalent. So proactively understanding the nature of job transition and collectively taking steps towards aiding society with upskilling will certainly help with driving inclusive growth, sustainable development, and well-being. In this testimony, I would like to offer a set of recommendations for facilitating the upskilling process through effective policy measures. The approach to upskilling needs to serve all ages and levels in the labor market. It needs to inform and educate the current workforce that directly or indirectly works with systems that will incorporate AI in the near future. It also needs to build a strong talent pipeline, which can then, in coming next years or decades, take the AI work forward. Third, the approach also needs to keep the current decision makers, that is industry leaders, informed and abreast with multifaceted implications in deploying AI. The considerations include, as the previous speaker was alluded to, like security, privacy, and ethics, bias, safety, confidentiality, explainability, and many more. So following are the set of concrete recommendations to realize this inclusive approach to upskilling the labor market. First, early opportunities. Exposing young minds of the nation to this field by offering AI in the school curriculum will help the workforce of tomorrow get prepared and get a head start in the field. It need not be a fully fledged, extremely technical curriculum. Instead, it can be a gradual introduction to the field. If young minds are exposed to this revolutionary technology early on, it will create a robust talent pipeline for years to come. Second, social awareness. Raising awareness to help society recognize the opportunities that lie for their well-being, with the increasing diffusion of AI, and not perceive it as a threat. That is preparing the mindset of the current labor market to interpret AI not as an adversary, instead approach it as an opportunity for them to experience better levels of well-being with the new technologies powered by AI, do the mundane tasks for them so that they can focus their energies into learning and executing more exciting tasks or value-adding tasks. So this is because AI is not just simply about automation and replacing people. AI can make existing workers more productive at their jobs by having AI platforms do the mundane and boring tasks and focusing the workers on higher value. An example would be using AI to schedule nurses in the hospital so that nurses themselves can focus on caring for patients instead of having to enter things manually to the computer. Third recommendation, shared responsibility in upskilling. Treating the task of upskilling the workforce in all the industries as a shared responsibility of the organization, the individual, and the massive open online course MOOC education system. I'm emphasizing on MOOC education system here because the route of traditional degrees is usually longer and cost prohibitive for majority of the workforce. So MOOCs targeted at honing needed skills by sharing the responsibility between the organization that is employing the people and the individual themselves can help upskill them more effectively, faster, keeping up with the pace of. Fourth, information dissemination. The dissemination of information from entities with similar interests of upskilling the workforce, such as federal government, state government, or corporations. The point is keeping the workforce informed with the expectations of the types of skills needed will go a long way in helping them understand what they need to do in order to. Example, with more automation being introduced, there will be more jobs relating to fixing and improving automation. Fixing robots as an example. There will also be new types of jobs introduced as well, such as data quality, governance, and efficiency. Fifth, and the last but not the least, diversity and inclusion. We just celebrated International Women's Day on March 8th. And inclusion is of paramount importance in labor market transition process. As the workforce is mobilized to upskill, it is crucial to ensure that the existing STEM gap does not get projected as such, or even worse, amplified in the process of upskilling. Moreover, diversity and inclusion is not just a humanitarian effort, it is actually economically smart strategy, because tapping into the female talent or the collective brain power of all genders and ethnicities must be tapped into for holistically harnessing the AI tech with whatever it has to offer. As the nation strives to ride the wave of AI-powered food industry. The US has continued to be at the forefront of technological innovation, not only nurturing the talent inside, but also attracting global talent with its ecosystem of fostering innovative and entrepreneurial spirit. I am myself an immigrant, an example of immigrant who has chosen to invest my time and energies into contributing to the growth of technology sphere of the US. Developing effective policy solutions that can help upskill the workforce to keep up with the pace of AI innovations will help the US maintain its leadership in the domain and would ultimately translate to the overall increased well-being of the society. To summarize, for ensuring a labor market transition that is constructively approached by all the parties, policy measures for building human capacity on AI with upskilling would be the key.
Actually, thank you very much. You touched on some really important points, and this commission is among other things, very focused on the impact of AI on the workforce. How do we create a workforce for tomorrow that is compatible with where we hope AI will help us to go? So thank you very much for your recommendations and your thoughts. We have time for a couple of questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, but this is, I'm with the American Enterprise Institute, and I study workforce-related issues, and I started really appreciate your comments. Very important. I think one of the big challenges is simply being able to put out a coherent picture of the employment impacts that we can foresee, right? So we know the technology is changing very rapidly. It's going to hit in places that we can't imagine right now. But industry could do a huge service to us if they could talk about the exposure the relative exposure of workers in various industries to AI and the need for them to be upskilled. I know it's going to be everywhere, but there are some people who are going to be at the front end, some are going to be a little bit further behind that. And just from my own perspective, I would love to see greater engagement from industry to say, and not just by sector, but even by geography, you know, how is this going to impact in the Bay Area compared to Austin, compared to other areas with different kinds of regional economies that have different industries in them. That level of information is really needed. So I'm just, is industry doing something in this realm across, you know, you've got a competitive atmosphere, right? So it's hard to have those conversations, but I'm really curious as to whether that is happening and where we can learn. Sorry, that's a lot.
And I know how it's helpful context. So I think industry in general right now is in a phase where they themselves are trying to figure out how to deploy the technologies which have been built. So yeah, I mean, confidential information apart, I think my experience has been having worked at a national lab and now at Microsoft. They are in the process of trying to really just build the platforms and test out the systems. So once they are able to test it out, that's when they can make any concrete recommendation of, okay, get, like, for example, if it's the utility industry and they're sending some applications for the people who are fixing the transmission lines or working on the distribution systems. It's hard at this point to tell, because once the application is deployed and has been tested thoroughly, that's when we can say what skills do they need to do. They need to know programming or more of software stuff, or
I think linking this technological conversation to our futurists who are more comfortable, like trying to project out, would be really useful. Because I know that in the intricacies of the technology, it's like you're concerned, or at company, Microsoft is concerned with the specifics of how something is going to work. But I think what we need is more of the landscape of where this is going to start impacting, so that we can meaningfully try to redirect resources to communities and to types of workers who are going to be impacted. So anyway.
I think I can add.
We have one more quick question. Go ahead, comment. Sorry.
Thanks. So you mentioned democratizing access to these systems and having more people participate in the development of AI. Can you speak on the challenges maybe in expertise in who develops AI versus the general public? One specific comment that comes to mind is Microsoft's Tay platform, which was deployed in the real world and trained using social networks, that was quickly in every IST in the world and had to be pulled offline. How do you balance expertise and the collective wisdom of the crowd?
Just a quick note before I answer that, these are my personal views, not Microsoft views. But I would say there are two phases, like how Austin was mentioning. One is developing and the research and all sorts of nice models. And then second, explicit example you have brought up, it's about actually training the model, letting people train the model, which was an experiment and it did fail. So that takes me to the points on the jobs of governance, ethicians. There are new jobs, or we need people who are dedicatedly working on understanding what data to use. Is it ethical to use that? What would be the governance of the data? So developing such systems which interact with the population to learn from them without any filter or without any intermediate processing of the data is likely not the way to go. There has to be some way of ensuring that the data which is being used to teach these learning methods is somehow being taken care of in terms of ethics and bias and all those things.
Actually, thank you very much.
test beds. So that's why the test beds project exists in the first place, purely because you won't be able to understand what the implications are, what you need to do at the application layer, unless you're able to do it.
Sakshi, thank you very much. And I'm going to continue to move through our panel. We have 10 minutes left, and that is for Anshu Srivastava, founder and CEO of Hurd AI. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Chairman Mike and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity today to holding this critical hearing. I'm currently an associate professor in the computer science department at Rice. I'm also founder and CEO of Hurd AI, a new startup working on democratizing artificial intelligence through mathematical innovations. My specialization is machine learning for very large data sets. I want to start with highlighting this, what is this ongoing race that is going on in building this large AI models, and why it is important, and why it can lead to some unintended consequences. So let me walk over a popular use of AI, question answering. So imagine I go to Alexa, Siri, or any of their Google Assistant and ask the question, when did Beyonce start becoming popular? Now the AI-enabled system will quickly match this question with a sentence from Wikipedia that says, it's a Wikipedia article on Beyonce that says she rose to fame in the late 1990s as a lead singer of Destiny's Child. And that will lead to the answer 1990, which is the correct answer. Now the system heavily relies on a special form of language model. Let's call it the core AI that understands the English language. So there is one AI that understands how we understand English language. For us, it's very easy. Yeah, when did she start becoming popular? She rose to fame 1990 Destiny's Child. Perfectly valid scenario. That's not easy for computers. So computer needs an AI to somehow recognize that rose to fame is same as start becoming popular. And it's not easy. In fact, we didn't know how to do it until very recently. The same AI will also match the intent when to the word 1990, as in you're trying to know something about the time. And these AI systems are remarkably accurate now, and we only got to control them or get some sense of how to make them work not more than 3 to 5 years back. Unfortunately, this core piece of AI that is supposed to understand the natural language is extremely expensive to build. What we are talking about is hardware infrastructure that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. These models are trained over weeks to months on terabytes of information. The model needs constant maintenance in the form of fine-tuning, retraining that costs tens of millions of dollars. Not to mention the cost and time associated with assembling a rare expert team for AI. In short, only a handful of entities today are in the position to build these models. The harsh reality of AI is that more investment results in better AI. This costly economics of building this core AI or core NLP, if you may say, results in a very vulnerable AI ecosystem. A handful of entities capable of making this core are now offering this core as a free service, because not everybody can build this, and they are offering this as a free AI service for the benefit of all. And we are constantly seeing that most AI systems are now blindly relying on this free AI service to build their ecosystem and software stack. And we are talking about AI systems that are almost everywhere: search engines, authentication systems, social networks, healthcare, paralegal, you name it. But we would like to understand this, that there is a core AI that not everybody can train. There are very few entities that can train and manage it. And because of the economics, everybody else is relying on that core understanding of language or images to build their other services. And we have seen this movie before, where the world gets addicted to a free service. The one who owns the free core AI implicitly control the meaning of the words and entities in every other system built upon. Implicitly, may or may not be intended. Imagine a day in which the core AI stops matching shoes with Nike, but very well matches it with its competitors, say Adidas. I can assure you that's not going to be a very good day for Nike. And all I gave you is just one example. You could replace Nike shoes, Adidas with anything, countries, connotations, meanings. All the systems are going to derive from this code. The problem is any reasonable audits for this AI system is almost impossible to achieve. Who are to be held accountable for? Is your system accountable? Is the core AI accountable? And like talking about a system which can hold certain AI system accountable, we are building AI that surpasses even our capability to understand things. Auditing them is like me with 1 year of knowledge of chess, trying to understand what a grandmaster is thinking and trying to stop him from doing something else. So we may not be sure about how to audit these systems. Now, in my opinion, our best hope is to ensure an ecosystem of AI where the core is decentralized or democratized. What I would like to think about is that we should be incentivizing, and I don't know the right mechanism, but we should be incentivizing entities to use entities using AI system to own their AI, build their AI. This will also help with accountability. Because if my system is relying on some other AI system, which is the core, then accountability is hard. But if I own the system, if I build it from scratch, then I own the system, and there could be some accountability. The same thing will also help us to enable faster AI innovation. We should be mindful of the fact that AI innovation is needed because if we are not doing it, somebody else is doing it. We cannot hamper the path to innovation, but if we ensure some sort of incentivization for everybody to start thinking about AI, to start building their AI, and if we can enable the masses to build these kind of bigger models or the core models on their own, we are not just fostering AI innovation, but we are also avoiding these possibilities of a vulnerable code. So I think in summary, a decentralized AI ecosystem is better and also healthy. Thank you.
Thank you. That's some provocative stuff. So thank you for that. And it kind of puts a fine point on some of the things that we've been grappling with a little bit. We have a minute or two for questions.
How can you build a system that understands morality? Because that's what you're getting at, is as a rule set.
I mean, I don't think we know that answer yet. And I don't imagine we'll know that anywhere soon in the future because the AI is based on mathematics. Now, mathematics, if you cannot define something, we cannot achieve it. So there has to be a formal definition of something for us to formally guarantee that we can achieve it. And things that does not have a formal definition, we can never guarantee that.
Yeah, like how well can you define morality? You know, all the way down into the pit of all moral things. So one interesting note that you might want to check out. I kid. I actually have something.
But I mean, take the classic Connor Stewart.
Yeah.
A machine can pretty well determine pornography. Okay, so that is an aspect of being able to program morality into code.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is there's an attempt to do this in GPT-3. They just released a new version of GPT-3 called Instruct, which is supposed to have more of the model core doc to be like, I don't know if more moral is necessarily the answer, but at least actively less harmful. Another system that they tried to implement, I believe, is called Palms. I think there's people here that would know more about this than me, but I believe it was called Palms, where they tried to put like value system cordon off on their large models. And so I think a lot of that morality decision, I mean, the real problem is going to be, especially since we're all like making general systems, what happens when a nation we don't like wants a morality system that governs on top of like a general purpose tool as like US regulator. But the morality question is
So right now, the way we put any sense to machine learning is by first defining it in a way that we believe is reasonable. And then we can force the system, because once we can mathematically quantify what is moral and what is not moral in some way, then we can impart that to system. But the whole thing breaks down because we are talking about everything starts in machine learning at a math level. Things needs to be formally defined. At a social level, things are not formally defined. And this gap is where all the details are.
But it is a huge issue. You're using the term moral. I use the term ethical, right? So how do you define moral? How do you define ethical? Which term will you use? These are the huge challenges in what I'm calling ethical AI. Absolutely.
Anshul, just one question. You talked about NLP and LG. I get that, but you're also talking about core AI. Anything else that you think should be a part of core AI other than your natural language?
So I just gave an illustration of natural language, right? People are building now in images, text, like even speeches. And in fact, they are building models there was a paper that says one model to rule them all, which was basically trying to do all of them together, right? So we don't really have we don't really have to just focus on NLP. This could be the core of what we think would be representations of images, right? I mean, so what I'm talking about is, like all the basic things that we can sense: images, speech, text.
So essentially, you'd argue that in core AI, first of all, define what would constitute that should be centralized, and then
right. And what I was saying is that modern AI works right now. There is this concept of pre-training and fine-tuning, and we have heard about that. Is basically somebody needs to go and understand these terabytes of information in a way that is consistent with our understanding of AI. And once we build this core, then this core automatically enables a very accurate AI. And that is needed, frankly, because otherwise these systems won't work. And these systems are working remarkably well and making our life easier. But the economics of how this system is working creates a potential for what we have seen before is you cannot now imagine something wrong happens here. We will never know whether it was intended or whether it was just an artifact of how things were.
Yeah, so so these models in general are called foundation models now. And I would say foundation models exist it's like what a baby learns first: perception, vision, and language and speech. But would you say that some of those models, or maybe the data sets that are used to train those models, should be public property, like the electromagnetic spectrum, or something that we have all agreed that maybe you can rent it, maybe you can get a part of it, but in general it belongs to the public and needs to be open. Otherwise, it's completely stifling competition, or it could completely stifle and lead to monopoly.
No, that's a great point. So right now, what is, like the models that I'm talking about are built on public data sets. So let's say these are Wikipedia data sets. If we are building a model with non-public data set and it's not there, then I don't think, we can be even consider that model to be, we don't know what is baked in that model. But these models are actually built on public data set, but the infrastructure cost is so much that even though like the whole Wikipedia of the web is free, you can download it. But
you cannot use it for, the fact that something is public, and that's an issue of scale, and sorry I'm jumping in, but we've been having this conversation before. ImageNet is images scraped from the internet, but still, I cannot use ImageNet for commercial purposes.
Right.
Or GPT-3, I don't even know what GPT-3 was trained on, and probably it was trained on.
45 terabytes of nonsense at $12 million pop.
Yeah, but is it public? Is it like what license? And when we say something is public, was it licensed for commercial use? Or Copilot by Microsoft, I understand, was trained on GitHub. On public code, people made that code public, but I don't think that they actually gave permission for profit use of the code, right? I don't know if anybody knows about this. But
why we need all the sectors looking at this.
So it's not as simple as when you say something is public. Sure, I can put my pictures up, but if a company is making profit, maybe I didn't consent. So it's not that simple. Yeah.
No, that is totally that's a totally valid point. Right? Data set is what you feed to these AI models is what they've done. So
I would make the suggestion that the public-private model. One of the issues that Stanford just put out, talking about foundation models, just put out pretty much GPT-2. 2, right? And so you're now 3 generations behind with Google's multimodal model, right? So I think if you can have a public-private partnership and increase shared or public or shared resources and create that competitor, that's what lives in the public. That's what you can run like massive iterative simulation on and see what weird stuff's on it. I think that's the only way we can possibly do that.
This is probably a perfect place to draw our session to a close today, because to me it really highlights how much more work we need to do. There are so many questions that need more advice and thinking and grappling, and that's what this commission is charged with doing. So hearing from folks like yourselves who have so much expertise and knowledge about these issues is incredibly helpful to us. So thank you very, very much for your time and your effort and your testimony and your sharing your thoughts and views with us here today. I'm going to turn it over to Tom Quadman from the Chamber of Commerce, which is the entity which is convening us all. So Tom.
Well, I want to thank our designated bad guy.
I'm a dad. I'm a really good bad guy.
No, I have to say, having been, as you were involved in many, many, many congressional hearings, they don't go this smoothly. And, first off, I want to thank the Austin Chamber, who are our great hosts today, for having us. I want to thank each one of you. I know I've talked, I think, with most of you individually. You get to deal with Jordan and Michael a lot, but I'm the guy behind the scenes making sure they have what they need. But, I know you're each taking a lot of time out of your day, out of your weeks to work on this very important project. So thank you. I do think, Shakar and I were having a little bit of a sidebar, and, Mike, you were just getting to this point too of this is a good scene setting, right? This is a good context, providing good context. And now we've really got to work through what these different issues are. What are the recommendations around that? And I was just, throughout the day, I've been reflecting a little bit on Will Hurd's opening remarks, because I think two of the points that he was making are at the very center of this. And this is why Jordan and I were talking about this project 2 years ago when we were just conceptualizing it. One is for the benefit of humanity, right? Because, AI is going to continue. So it's like, how can it be used in the best ways for, for society? And then the other side of it is too, we have to put our parochial interests aside, right? I mean, traditionally you hear the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, it's like, oh, they're the anti-regulation people. Well, no, we're not that here, right? We need to have the right structures. We need to have the right rules in place in order for this technology to develop and to move forward. And, Jordan and I have also been very careful as well that we wanted to make sure we're doing an international component. We want to make sure we were having EU engagement, UK engagement. And Mike, to your point, earlier today, those discussions are much, much more important. I think have a much, different veneer now than they would have had even 3 weeks ago. So really want to thank each one of you for that. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. We've flipped the order a little bit. That Claire has been able to make it. So just a couple more minutes and we'll let you go on your way, and we'll see you all in Cleveland. And thank you. So Claire.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am Claire Bishik from Intel. It's an honor to be here. My early presence in the testimony is like normal. And Austin traffic is what we expected to be, given our privileges today. So I certainly appreciate this opportunity to talk to this distinguished audience. And I would like to focus on a few areas that have not yet been covered by others. Artificial intelligence certainly captured the imagination of technologists, policymakers, and end users. But this technology, the thought that we could emulate the human brain by computers is not new. Even machine learning is not new at all. The idea of artificial intelligence emerged in the 1960s together with the computers and neural networks, ideas that brought them forward appeared in 1980s. So why was there such a delay between the ideas and everyone using artificial intelligence as we know it today? There were many factors, such as changing the paradigm, looking at what the computers did better rather than attempting to emulate the human brain. But the most important factor was a different one. It was that advanced computing, the computing power, was finally ready to process all this information, and that the computing infrastructure to support it already existed. We are talking about networks, storage, battery power, ability to formalize data, and many other things. So, the field of artificial intelligence as we know it today would not have been possible without those advances in computing. And semiconductors especially, of course, serve as the foundation for this ecosystem. And this is what drives artificial intelligence as we know it now. So I would like to say a few words before pointing out to a few important areas for end-to-end artificial intelligence view, the big picture for artificial intelligence that sometimes is not easily captured. Artificial intelligence as a technology has significant benefits. Frequently when I participate in meetings where people talk about artificial intelligence, they talk about risks, they talk about concerns. And it is true that artificial intelligence cannot exist without addressing the concerns having to do with ethics, having to do with privacy, having to do with fighting bias, and a number of other issues. But it's also true that the majority of competitive applications in artificial intelligence systems that provide the most benefit today are not human-facing. They are based on data that is not personal data. Those are things that have tremendous impact on efficiency of the economy that makes everyone's lives better. Among those applications, I would like to mention things like network orchestration, something that allows you to use networks without bottlenecks, even when there is peak traffic. Things like early detection of defects on the manufacturing floor. Things like capturing issues in the soundness of a building before it collapses by taking millions of pictures. Things like looking at the terrain or capturing weather information from the sensor and processing it. All these applications are machine-to-machine applications. On the other end is another machine that uses this information for a beneficial process, not a human. And this is important to understand. We are talking about this highly beneficial technology, and we need to see the benefits at the same time as we talk about the risks, including societal risks. I would like here to highlight a few areas that I think are extremely important for the angle of competitiveness with regard to artificial intelligence that will help the United States preserve our leadership in technology, in emerging technologies in general, including artificial intelligence. The important thing is to see the big picture. It's great to focus on algorithms, to focus on data, the nature of data, but there will be no algorithms, no data if you don't have the semiconductor infrastructure that is capable of supporting them. So when we are talking about competitiveness, and this is usually the discussion of R&D and commercialization, we have to see the big picture. We have to start at the bottom. Advanced semiconductors, hardware, network, storage allow you to have the system that allows you to process algorithms in a way that approximates the decision-making of the human brain, although it does it differently. So innovation in security and privacy is important for the success of artificial intelligence, but it is also the area that is rooted in hardware, as well as energy efficiency. It's great to aspire to be as energy efficient as possible. This is a challenge in artificial intelligence, but it's impossible to do it without advanced processors that allow you to do things that save energy, such things as approximate computing, where you don't expend cycles and therefore energy on something that's not essential, something that's low impact, on things such as homomorphic encryption, for instance, that allows you to combine data from various data sources without jeopardizing privacy. It is something that supports near data processing with native architectures. Today, more energy cycles are spent moving data than processing data. So if you can process data at the source, it will create a lot of difference. So, because a couple of words on the regulatory frameworks, because artificial intelligence is so horizontal, so broad, it spans from, manufacturing to education and everything in between. It's important to know that we have already very powerful, functional, actionable regulatory frameworks in most of those areas. Adapting them to artificial intelligence rather than building new controls is probably the best way to go. It's something that will allow technologists and users and regulators to integrate artificial intelligence in their everyday life as quickly as possible. And because artificial intelligence is so broad horizontally and so pervasive vertically from the bottom processors to the top, human factors in using the computers, it's also impossible to do a lot of work through private-public partnerships to ensure that we invest and we support as collaborators the big picture from the processors to the human beings that use the systems. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak here today. And well, again, I want to congratulate you with the gradual but visible return to the normal life after 2 years of pandemic. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That is a wrap. Thank you, everybody, for a great first session. Appreciate it very much.